It began on a night like any other, though something about the air felt wrong. The wind carried an eerie chill, whispering secrets that no one wanted to hear. Emily didn't notice at first. She was too preoccupied with the glowing screen of her phone, scrolling through endless notifications as the clock ticked closer to midnight. It wasn't until her dog Max began growling softly at the door that she looked up. "Max," she called, her voice low but tinged with unease. The dog didn't respond, his ears pinned back, his body tense. He was staring at the front door as if expecting someone, or something, to come through it. Emily set her phone down, her heart beginning to race. "Who's there?" she called out, though she already knew no one would answer. She walked slowly to the door, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the lock, her mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe Max had heard a raccoon or some other harmless creature. But when she peered through the peephole, she saw nothing. Just darkness. A thick, suffocating blackness that seemed to press against the glass, as if trying to seep into her home. The street light that usually illuminated her front yard was out, leaving everything in shadow. Emily locked the door and took a step back, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination. But then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. Her stomach dropped. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful to be the wind. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room, landing on the large bay window at the far end of the living room. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Her breath hitched. For a moment she was frozen, her mind screaming at her to run but her body refusing to move. She forced herself to take a step forward, then another, each one heavier than the last. As she reached the window, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the edge of the curtain. Should she look? Did she even want to know what was out there? Before she could decide, the hand vanished. She yanked the curtain open, her heart pounding in her chest, but the yard was empty. The wind rustled the trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Emily exhaled a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But then her phone buzzed. She jumped, letting out a small yelp before laughing nervously at herself. She walked back to the couch, picking up her phone to check the notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "Don't look outside." Her blood ran cold. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was this some kind of sick joke? She looked around the room, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows, but she was alone. Or so she thought. The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Emily's heart nearly stopped. She lived alone. Slowly she set the phone down, her hands trembling. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candle holder, and tiptoed toward the staircase. Each step she took felt like an eternity, the sound of her breathing loud in the suffocating silence. The footsteps stopped. She reached the top of the stairs, her knuckles white as she gripped the makeshift weapon. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from her bedroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, a faint glow spilling out into the corridor. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. She stepped into the hallway, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. As she approached the bedroom, she noticed something strange. The light wasn't coming from her bedside lamp or her phone, it was coming from the mirror. She hesitated in the doorway, staring at the mirror. The glass shimmered unnaturally, like water rippling in a breeze. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was off. The expression wasn't hers. The eyes were darker, the smile too wide, too knowing. The reflection moved. Emily screamed, stumbling back as the figure in the mirror stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass. It tilted its head, watching her with a twisted curiosity. Then, without warning, it raised a hand and pointed behind her. Emily spun around, but there was nothing there. When she turned back to the mirror, the reflection was gone. The glass was smooth and empty, showing only the room behind her. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room with all the lights on, clutching Max tightly as the hours dragged by. But the message on her phone haunted her. "Don't look outside." Who had sent it? How had they known? And most importantly, what would have happened if she had looked? By the time the sun rose, Emily was no closer to answers. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened that night wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Emily spent the next day in a fog, her mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over. She kept checking her phone, half expecting another message from the unknown number, but it stayed silent. It was almost worse that way. At least if there had been another message, she'd know someone, or something, was out there. The silence left her with nothing but questions and a gnawing sense of dread. She tried to convince herself it was just a prank, maybe some tech-savvy teenager messing with her. But every time she thought about the hand on the window or the reflection in the mirror, her stomach twisted. Pranks didn't feel like this. This felt personal. By evening, Emily decided she couldn't stay in the house another night. She needed answers, or at least the comfort of being around someone else. She grabbed her keys and headed out, leaving every light in the house on. Max whined as she locked the door, but she patted his head reassuringly. "I'll be back soon, buddy." Her first stop was her neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, who had lived on the street for over 30 years. If anyone knew about strange happenings in the area, it would be her. Emily knocked on the door, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't quite explain. The door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Wilson's familiar face. "Emily, dear, what brings you here so late?" I had a weird night," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Did you notice anything strange? Any noises or people?" Mrs. Wilson frowned, stepping aside to let Emily in. Come in. You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around the cup of tea Mrs. Wilson had placed in front of her. She recounted everything: the hand on the window, the footsteps upstairs, the mirror. By the time she finished, Mrs. Wilson was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You said you got a message?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her voice low. Emily nodded. "Yeah. It just said, 'Don't look outside.'" Mrs. Wilson's hand trembled as she reached for her tea. "There's a story about the street. Something most of the newer residents don't know." Emily leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "What kind of story?" Mrs. Wilson hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell her. "It happened years ago. A young woman lived in your house all by herself. People said she was strange, always talking about seeing things that weren't there. One night she disappeared. No one ever found her, but there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Emily pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Something outside her window." Emily's blood ran cold. "You think this has something to do with her?" "I don't know," Mrs. Wilson said, shaking her head. "But whatever it is, you need to be careful. If you see or hear anything else, don't ignore it." Emily left Mrs. Wilson's house feeling more unsettled than ever. The story only raised more questions, and she still didn't have any answers. As she walked back to her house, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest hint of something foul. She wrinkled her nose, glancing around, but the street was empty. When she got home, she double-checked all the locks and made sure every window was shut tight. Max greeted her at the door, his tail wagging nervously. She spent the rest of the evening glued to the couch, her eyes darting to the windows every few minutes. It wasn't until well past midnight that her phone buzzed again. Her heart leapt into her throat as she picked it up, the screen glowing ominously in the dark. "It's watching you." The message was from the same unknown number. Emily's hands shook as she stared at the words. She wanted to throw the phone across the room, but she couldn't look away. What did it mean? What was watching her? A loud thud from the backyard made her jump. She grabbed the candle holder again, her only semblance of protection, and crept toward the back door. Max followed close behind, his low growl vibrating in the silence. When she reached the door, she peered through the glass, her breath fogging up the surface. At first, she didn't see anything. The backyard was still, the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. But then, in the corner of the yard, something moved. It was faint, barely more than a ripple in the darkness. But as Emily squinted, she realized it wasn't the wind or an animal. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing perfectly still. Its face was obscured, but its head was tilted, as if it were looking directly at her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. When she looked again, the figure was gone. She locked the door, double-checking it twice, and backed away, clutching the candle holder like a lifeline. Max barked, his fur bristling as he stared at the same spot in the yard. The next morning, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She called the police, reporting the strange figure and the messages. An officer came by to take a statement, but there wasn't much they could do. Could be a prank, the officer said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it himself. "Just keep your doors locked and call us if you see anything else." But the figure wasn't a prank. Emily knew that in her bones. And as the days turned into nights, the messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "It's closer than you think. Don't trust the mirrors. Whatever you do, don't fall asleep." Emily was running out of options. She was terrified to stay in the house, but she didn't know where else to go. And every time she tried to leave, she felt it, the weight of something watching her, following her. By the end of the week, she was barely sleeping, barely eating. The once cozy house felt like a prison, its walls closing in around her. And though she hadn't seen the figure again, she felt its presence everywhere. Late one night, as she sat in the living room with all the lights on, her phone buzzed again. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the message glaring back at her like a warning. "You can't hide forever." Emily couldn't sleep. She hadn't slept properly in days, and it was beginning to show. Her reflection in the mirror, though she barely dared to look at it anymore, was gaunt and hollow-eyed. Every sound, every shadow, sent her heart racing. Max, usually her constant source of comfort, had become just as anxious as she was, barking at corners of the room as if he could see something she couldn't. The latest message had been haunting her thoughts. "You can't hide forever." Hide from what? Or from whom? Emily didn't know, but she was starting to feel like her house was a trap. She needed to get out. She needed air. At just past midnight, she grabbed her coat, slipped Max's leash on, and stepped out into the cold night. The air was sharp and biting, carrying the scent of damp earth. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Even the wind seemed to have stilled. Emily didn't have a destination in mind. She just needed to move, to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of her home. Max trotted nervously beside her, his ears twitching at every sound. As she walked, her mind kept replaying the strange figure in her backyard, the messages, the stories Mrs. Wilson had told her. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was connected, but she didn't know how. Her feet carried her farther than she intended, to the edge of the woods that bordered the neighborhood. She hesitated. The woods were dense, their tangled branches forming a canopy that seemed to swallow the moonlight. It felt wrong to go in, but something about the darkness called to her. Max let out a low growl, his leash pulling taut as he resisted moving forward. Emily glanced down at him, her heart sinking. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max didn't respond, but his growl deepened, his eyes fixed on the shadows ahead. Emily followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, at least nothing she could see. And then she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. "Emily?" Her breath caught. She froze, her eyes darting around the darkened trees. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the whisper came again, closer this time. "Emily?" Her grip on Max's leash tightened as her pulse thundered in her ears. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't Mrs. Wilson, and it definitely wasn't anyone she knew. "Show yourself," she shouted, her voice cracking. The only response was the rustling of leaves, though there was no wind. Max barked, a sharp, panicked sound that made her jump. His leash slipped from her hand as he bolted into the woods. "Max!" she yelled, running after him. The branches clawed at her skin, and the ground was uneven beneath her feet, but she didn't care. She couldn't lose Max, not now. The whispering grew louder as she ran, more insistent. It wasn't just her name anymore, it was a cacophony of voices, overlapping and echoing in her ears. "Don't stop. Keep running. It's coming." Emily didn't know what it was, but the fear in the voices was enough to keep her moving. She stumbled through the trees, her lungs burning and her heart pounding. Finally, she saw Max up ahead, standing in a small clearing. He was facing away from her, his body rigid, his tail between his legs. "Max!" she called again, her voice hoarse. He didn't move. As she approached, she realized he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at something beyond the clearing. Something she couldn't see yet. "Max, come here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He whimpered but didn't budge. Emily's steps faltered as she reached the edge of the clearing. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to see what Max was staring at. But her eyes were drawn to it as if pulled by an invisible force. At first, she thought it was a tree, its silhouette dark against the night sky. But then it moved. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long and too thin. its head tilted to one side just like the figure in her backyard. Emily's breath hitched as it turned toward her, its face, or what should have been its face, shrouded in darkness. Her legs refused to move. She was rooted to the spot, her mind screaming at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath her feet with each step it took. Max barked again, snapping Emily out of her paralysis. She turned and ran, grabbing his leash as she passed him. He followed without hesitation, his paws thudding against the forest floor. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic. "Don't let it catch you. It's closer. Run faster." Emily didn't dare look back. She could feel it behind her, its presence like a weight pressing against her back. The trees blurred as she sprinted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally burst out of the woods and onto the street, she collapsed onto the pavement, her legs trembling. Max was beside her, panting heavily but unharmed. She looked back at the woods, expecting to see the creature emerging from the shadows, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the whispers gone. For a moment she thought she might have imagined it all. But then she saw the marks. On the ground where she had fallen, there were long, deep scratches, as if something had been dragged across the pavement. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat in the living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. Max stayed by her side, his ears perked and his eyes alert. When her phone buzzed again, she nearly dropped it. The message was short, but it sent a chill down her spine. "You can't run." Emily didn't know how long she sat there, staring at her phone screen. The words burned into her mind, "You can't run." Her heart raced, and her hands trembled as she placed the phone on the coffee table, as if putting distance between herself and the message would make it less real. Max sat at her feet, his head resting on her lap. He seemed calmer now, though his eyes occasionally darted toward the front door, ears twitching at the faintest sound. Emily's thoughts spiraled. Who, or what, was sending her these messages? And why her? She hadn't done anything, hadn't crossed anyone. Her life had been quiet, uneventful. Until now. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. Her first instinct was to call the police, but what would she even tell them? That a faceless figure was stalking her through cryptic text messages and whispers in the woods? They'd think she was losing her mind. Maybe she was. But the scratches on the pavement were real. The figure in the woods was real. And the overwhelming sense of being watched, that was all too real. Emily's gaze shifted to the window. The curtains were drawn, but she felt exposed, as if something, or someone, was on the other side, watching and waiting. She got up, her legs shaky, and double-checked every lock in the house. The front door, the back door, the windows, everything was secured. Yet it didn't make her feel safe. As she moved through the house, she realized just how silent it had become. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual, each second dragging out like an eternity. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like a storm was brewing. She stopped in front of the hallway mirror, catching her reflection out of the corner of her eye. She looked worse than she had earlier, pale, disheveled, her eyes hollow with fear. But then she noticed something else. Her reflection wasn't moving. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but her reflection remained still, its eyes locked on hers. Slowly, it raised a hand, not to mimic her, but to reach toward the glass, as if trying to cross into her world. Emily stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Max, who barked furiously at the mirror. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed a blanket, threw it over the mirror, and ran back to the living room, her heart pounding like a drum. She needed help. Her fingers fumbled as she unlocked her phone and opened her contacts. She scrolled past names she hadn't spoken to in years, her thumb hovering over her best friend Sarah's name. They hadn't talked in months, not since Sarah had moved out of town, but Sarah would understand. She always did. Before Emily could press the call button, her phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look. Every instinct told her to throw the phone across the room, to smash it into a million pieces. But she couldn't ignore it. The message was different this time. It wasn't a threat. It was a question. "Do you remember?" Emily's blood ran cold. Remember what? The phone buzzed again. "You can't forget. No matter how hard you try." She dropped the phone, her hands trembling. The words felt like they were clawing into her mind, dragging up memories she couldn't place. It was like trying to recall a dream that faded the moment she woke up. Her thoughts were interrupted by Max, who let out a low growl. He was staring at the front door now, his hackles raised. A knock echoed through the house. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. Emily stood frozen, her feet rooted to the floor. She glanced at the peephole, but the thought of looking through it made her stomach churn. The knocking stopped. For a moment there was silence, so complete it was deafening. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the house. Emily backed away, clutching a kitchen knife she'd grabbed without even realizing it. Max barked and growled, pacing back and forth between her and the windows. The footsteps stopped at the back door. "Who's there?" Emily shouted, her voice cracking. There was no answer. She took a shaky step forward, the knife trembling in her hand. "I'm calling the police," she yelled, though her phone was still lying on the floor in the living room. A voice came from the other side of the door. It was soft, almost familiar, but twisted in a way that made her skin crawl. "Emily, let me in." Her blood turned to ice. She didn't recognize the voice, but it felt like she should. It was like hearing a song from childhood that she couldn't quite place. "No," she shouted, her voice stronger this time. "Leave me alone." The voice laughed, a low, chilling sound that echoed in her ears long after it stopped. "You can't hide," it said. The doorknob rattled, and then there was a loud bang as something slammed against the door. Emily screamed, running back to the living room to grab her phone. She dialed 911 with shaking hands, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone at my house," she said, her voice frantic. "They're trying to break in." The operator's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Can you see them? Are they still there?" Emily glanced toward the back door, but the banging had stopped. The house was silent again except for Max's low growls. "I don't know. I don't see anyone, but they were here. They knocked and then they tried to." Her words caught in her throat as she noticed something on the floor by the back door. It was a photograph slipped under the door. "Ma'am, are you still there?" the operator asked. Emily picked up the photograph with trembling hands. It was old, faded, and creased, but she recognized it instantly. It was her. But it wasn't recent. It was a picture of her as a child, standing in front of a house she didn't recognize. "Ma'am?" the operator repeated. I have to go," Emily stammered, hanging up the phone before they could respond. She flipped the photo over and her heart nearly stopped. Scrawled on the back in messy, jagged handwriting were the words, "It's time to remember." Emily felt a wave of nausea as memories she didn't know she had began to surface. Flashes of a house, of dark rooms, of whispers in the night. She sank to the floor, clutching the photo as tears streamed down her face. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Whoever, or whatever, was tormenting her wasn't going to stop. Not until she remembered. Emily sat on the floor, staring at the photograph as if it were a living, breathing thing. Her mind swirled with confusion and fear. What was this place? Why did it look so familiar yet completely alien? She could feel the edges of her memory fraying, as if something long buried was clawing its way to the surface. Max barked sharply, breaking her trance. His body was tense, and he was staring at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. His growls were low and guttural, his tail stiff. Emily followed his gaze, her heart racing. She didn't want to move, didn't want to look, but something was pulling her, something she couldn't resist. The hallway stretched before her, the dim light casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. As she took a tentative step forward, the air seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on her chest. Each step echoed in the silence, the sound unnaturally loud in her ears. When she reached the end of the hallway, she froze. The door to her bedroom, which she distinctly remembered closing, was now slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness seeped through the opening, and she could feel a cold draft emanating from within. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog stood at her side, his ears flat against his head. He let out a low whine, his eyes darting between her and the door. Emily reached out with a shaking hand and pushed the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Everything seemed normal at first glance. Her bed was neatly made, her belongings untouched. But then she saw it. In the middle of her bed lay another photograph. Her legs felt like jelly as she approached it. The photo was similar to the first, old, faded, and creased. This time it showed her sitting on a swing in a park. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. But it wasn't the image of her younger self that made her stomach churn. It was the figure standing behind her. It was a man, tall and shadowy, his features obscured. He wore a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in darkness. Emily had no memory of this man, yet something about him sent a chill down her spine. It was like looking at a ghost from a nightmare she couldn't quite remember. Her hands trembled as she flipped the photo over. Written on the back in the same jagged handwriting were the words, "He's waiting." Emily stumbled back, her mind reeling. Who was this man? And what was he waiting for? Her breathing grew shallow as panic set in. She had to get out of this house. She had to leave now. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Sarah's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then finally a voice answered. "Hello? Sarah. Thank God. I need..." But the voice on the other end wasn't Sarah's. It was a deep, distorted voice that sent a wave of cold terror through her. "Emily," it said, stretching out her name like a taunt. "You can't run." She screamed and threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. The screen cracked. Max barked furiously, his growls echoing in the small space. Emily felt tears streaming down her face as she clutched at her hair, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then she heard it. A creak, slow and deliberate, coming from the living room. Emily's body went rigid. She grabbed the knife from her bedside table. She had placed it there after the earlier incident, just in case, and crept back down the hallway. Max followed close behind, his growls never ceasing. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow from the streetlight outside. At first she didn't see anything, but then her eyes landed on the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving back and forth as if someone had just gotten up from it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. She clutched the knife tighter, her knuckles white. There was no answer. The chair creaked to a stop and the room fell silent once more. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the window, she could see the faint outline of a figure standing behind her. It was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that cast its face in shadow. Emily spun around, her knife raised, but there was nothing there. Her chest heaved as she backed away, her mind racing. Was she losing her mind? Was any of this real? The answer came in the form of another knock at the door. This one was loud, insistent, shaking the very walls of the house. Emily's heart leapt into her throat as she stared at the door, her body frozen in fear. "Emily," the voice came again, muffled but unmistakable. "It's time." Time for what? She didn't want to know. She turned and ran toward the back door, throwing it open without thinking. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she didn't care. She had to get out, had to escape. But as she stepped into the backyard, she froze. The world around her seemed wrong. The trees were taller than she remembered, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the sky. The air was thick with a fog that clung to her skin, and the moonlight seemed dimmer, as if the night itself was swallowing the light. And then she saw him. The man in the wide-brimmed hat stood at the edge of the yard, his silhouette blending into the shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there watching her. Emily's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She could feel his gaze, piercing and cold, as if he were staring directly into her soul. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "What do you want from me?" The man tilted his head as if amused. And then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at her. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, and she stumbled back, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. And then he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You know me." The words hit her like a physical blow. She didn't know this man, she was sure of it. And yet, deep down, a part of her did. A part of her recognized him, even if her conscious mind refused to accept it. The fog thickened around her, and the world seemed to spin. Emily felt her knees give out, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The man began to walk toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Stay away from me." But he didn't stop. Emily's body refused to move, as if the weight of the man's presence had paralyzed her. His slow, deliberate steps echoed through the fog, each one reverberating in her ears like a drumbeat. She clutched at the dirt beneath her, trying to will her legs to work, but it was as if the air itself had wrapped around her, holding her in place. Max barked furiously, charging toward the figure. Emily tried to call him back, but her voice caught in her throat. The dog's barking grew louder, more frantic as he closed the distance. Then, suddenly, there was silence. Emily blinked, her heart hammering in her chest. Max was gone. No bark, no whine, just empty, suffocating silence. Her voice finally broke free and she screamed into the night. Max! The fog seemed to pulse around her, responding to her panic. She crawled backward, her gaze locked on the man who now stood a few feet away. His hat obscured his face, but she could feel his eyes on her, cold and unrelenting. "Where's my dog?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering her question. Then he extended his arm, his long fingers pointing toward the forest behind her house. Emily turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. The trees loomed like shadowy giants, their gnarled branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The path into the woods seemed to beckon her, dark and foreboding. Her instincts screamed at her to run in the opposite direction, but something about the man's silent command compelled her. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking, and stumbled toward the edge of the forest. "Max!" she called again, her voice echoing through the trees. The forest swallowed her words, the air growing colder with each step she took. The ground beneath her feet felt damp, the leaves slick and unsteady. She could barely see a few feet ahead, the fog thickening with every passing moment. And then she heard it, a faint whimper. "Max," she whispered, her heart leaping. The sound came again, louder this time. She broke into a run, ignoring the branches that tore at her skin and the uneven ground that threatened to trip her. The whimper grew closer, guiding her deeper into the forest. Finally she saw him. Max was lying in a small clearing, his body trembling. She rushed to his side, relief flooding her as she knelt beside him. "Max, are you okay?" she asked, running her hands over his fur. He looked up at her with wide, terrified eyes, his body pressed against the ground as if he were trying to disappear into it. But then Emily realized he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on something behind her. Slowly she turned her head. The man was there, standing at the edge of the clearing. His presence seemed to suck the warmth from the air, leaving only a cold, hollow void. "What do you want from me?" Emily demanded, her voice breaking. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand again, pointing toward the ground beneath her feet. Emily looked down, her breath catching in her throat. The earth was shifting, cracks spreading outward like spiderwebs. Something was buried there, something that the man wanted her to see. Her hands trembled as she began to claw at the dirt. It was cold and unyielding, but she dug with a desperation she couldn't explain. Max whimpered beside her, his body pressed against hers as if he were trying to shield her from whatever was coming. As she dug, a shape began to emerge. A box, small and wooden, its surface etched with strange symbols. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through her, but she couldn't stop. She had to know what was inside. Her fingers found the edges of the lid, and she pried it open. Inside was a single object, a necklace. It was simple, with a delicate chain and a small pendant in the shape of a crescent moon. But the moment Emily touched it, a flood of memories surged through her mind. She saw herself as a child, playing in the yard of a house she didn't recognize. She was wearing the necklace, laughing as a woman called her name. The woman's face was kind, her eyes warm, but there was a sadness in her smile. And then the memory shifted. The woman was gone and the yard was empty. Emily was alone, clutching the necklace as tears streamed down her face. The vision ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Emily gasping for air. She looked at the necklace in her hand, her mind racing. Who was the woman? And why had she forgotten her? The man stepped closer, his presence pressing down on her like a weight. Emily clutched the necklace to her chest, her eyes narrowing. "What is this?" she demanded. "What are you trying to show me?" For the first time the man spoke. His voice was low and hollow, like the echo of a distant storm. "You already know." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She shook her head, refusing to believe it. "I don't know. I don't understand any of this." The man extended his hand, palm up, as if asking for the necklace. Emily hesitated, her grip tightening around it. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer. But in his silence she felt a strange pull, a compulsion she couldn't resist. Slowly, reluctantly, she placed the necklace in his hand. The moment the necklace touched his palm, the forest seemed to dissolve around her. The trees faded into darkness, the ground disappearing beneath her feet. She felt as if she were floating in a void, surrounded by an oppressive silence. And then the visions began. She saw the house again, the one from the photograph. She saw herself as a child, running through its halls, her laughter echoing. But there was something else, a shadow that loomed behind her, growing closer with each step. The visions came faster, each one more terrifying than the last. A room filled with whispers, a mirror that didn't reflect her face, a door that led to nowhere. And then she saw him, the man with the hat. He was always there, watching, waiting. Emily screamed, the sound tearing through the void. She wanted to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but there was no way out. When the visions finally ended, she was back in the forest. The man was gone, and the necklace lay in her hand. But something had changed. The fog was thicker now, the air colder. And Emily could feel it, a presence watching her from the shadows. She wasn't alone anymore. Emily's breath clouded in the icy air as she clutched the necklace tightly in her trembling hand. The forest, now darker and more hostile than ever, seemed to pulse with life, as though it was watching her, listening to her every thought. The man was gone, but the weight of his presence lingered, heavy and oppressive, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Max whined softly beside her, his fur bristling, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. Emily knew they needed to leave, but her legs refused to move. Something was keeping her rooted to the spot. Then it came, a low, guttural sound, deep within the forest. It was unlike anything she had ever heard, a mix of a growl and a moan, distant but closing in fast. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. "Max, we have to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She stood slowly, her knees shaking, and turned toward the path she thought would lead her back to the house. But the forest seemed to have shifted, the trees rearranging themselves like a labyrinth. There was no path. Panic rose in her chest as she spun around, looking for any sign of the way out. But all she saw was darkness, endless and suffocating. And then she realized, the sound was coming from all around her. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The growling stopped abruptly, leaving behind an even more unsettling silence. Emily's chest tightened as she strained to listen, her ears picking up every rustle of leaves, every creak of branches. And then she saw them. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness, surrounding her. "Stay back," she yelled, holding the necklace out in front of her like a weapon. The eyes didn't move. They hovered in place, unblinking as if waiting for something. Emily's grip on the necklace tightened, her knuckles white. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel its power pulsing faintly against her palm. And then she heard it, a voice, soft and distant, carried on the wind. "Emily?" Her blood turned to ice. It wasn't the man's voice this time. It was a woman's, gentle and familiar, echoing from somewhere deep within her memory. "Who are you?" Emily called out, her voice shaking. There was no response, but the eyes began to move, slowly closing in. She backed away, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she didn't know where to go. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "Trust the necklace, Emily. It will guide you." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but she had no time to question them. The eyes were closing in fast, their faint glow illuminating twisted, monstrous shapes behind them. Without thinking, Emily gripped the necklace tightly and closed her eyes. She focused on the pendant, on the strange, unexplainable energy she felt coursing through it. "Please," she whispered, "help me." The pendant grew warm in her hand, the heat spreading up her arm and into her chest. A faint glow began to emanate from it, growing brighter and brighter until it pierced through the darkness. The creatures recoiled, their growls turning into shrieks as the light grew stronger. Emily opened her eyes, and for the first time she could see them clearly. They were grotesque, twisted figures, their bodies misshapen and unnatural, their eyes filled with malice. But the light from the necklace seemed to repel them, forcing them back into the shadows. Emily didn't wait to see if it would hold. She grabbed Max by the collar and ran, the light from the pendant illuminating the ground ahead of her. The forest seemed to shift again, the trees parting to form a narrow path. Emily followed it without hesitation, her lungs burning as she pushed herself to keep going. The growls faded behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The forest seemed endless, the path stretching on, but she kept moving, the light from the necklace her only guide. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she saw it, a faint glimmer of light in the distance. She ran toward it, her heart pounding, and burst through the edge of the forest. She stumbled into the yard of her house, collapsing onto the grass. Max barked excitedly, licking her face as she struggled to catch her breath. For a moment there was silence. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting. Emily looked around, her eyes scanning the yard, but there was no sign of the man or the creatures. She sat up slowly, the necklace still clutched in her hand. Its glow had faded, but the warmth lingered, a comforting presence in the aftermath of the terror. But even as she tried to calm herself, a new question began to form in her mind. The voice, the woman who had spoken to her, who was she? And how did she know Emily's name? As she stared at the necklace, a memory surfaced, unbidden and incomplete. The woman from the photograph, the one who had been erased. She was wearing the same necklace. Emily's hands trembled as she turned the pendant over, searching for any clue. And then she saw it, an inscription, faint but legible. For my daughter, Emily. May this always protect you. Her breath caught in her throat. The woman in the photograph wasn't just someone she had known. She was her mother. But how? Emily had no memory of her, no recollection of anything beyond the life she had lived in this house. Who had erased her memories? And why? The sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway pulled her from her thoughts. She turned her head, her heart racing as she saw a figure approaching. It wasn't the man this time. It was a woman, her face hidden by the shadows, but there was something familiar about her. Emily, the woman said softly, her voice trembling. It's time you knew the truth. The fear that had gripped Emily moments ago was replaced by a different kind of dread, the dread of answers she wasn't sure she was ready for. But there was no turning back now. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't about monsters in the dark, but the truths hidden within ourselves. If you've stayed with me this far, you're already braver than most. But there's one thing you can do to keep the light alive. Share this story with someone who needs to feel the thrill, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales that will stay with you long after the lights go out. Because every story has a piece of you in it, and the next one might just be closer than you think. Story 2. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. Sarah had just finished putting the last load of laundry in the dryer and was settling down with a warm cup of tea. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house shifted. Her husband was away for a business trip, and the kids were at a friend's sleepover. This was supposed to be her time, her peace. But the quiet was unsettling. There was something about the stillness that felt wrong, as if the silence was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this way in the house, but tonight, it was more pronounced, more urgent. She couldn't put her finger on it, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She took a slow sip of her tea, trying to calm her nerves, but her hands were shaking. The house seemed too empty, too quiet. The walls, once comforting, now felt as though they were closing in on her. She'd lived here for years, and yet, tonight, everything felt foreign, unfamiliar. Her mind wandered, imagining the things that might be lurking in the dark corners of her home. Silly thoughts, she tried to tell herself. But the thought of being alone in this old house started to gnaw at her. Then it happened. A knock at the door. She froze. Her heart skipped a beat. It was soft, almost like a child's knock, tentative and delicate. No one ever came by at this hour. The delivery men were long gone for the day. She hadn't ordered anything. The neighbors knew not to bother her late at night. Another knock, this time louder, sharper. She stood there for a moment, unable to move, unable to think. Who could it be? A part of her wanted to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't heard. But the sound felt important, almost like a warning. Slowly, she set her tea down on the counter and made her way to the front door, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. Each step felt heavier, as if the house itself was urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had to know. When she reached the door, she hesitated. A sense of dread washed over her. Why hadn't the knock stopped? Was someone out there just waiting? Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cold metal sending a jolt of unease through her fingertips. What was she doing? She pulled her hand away for a moment, taking a breath, trying to steady herself. Her mind screamed at her to look through the peephole first, to be sure, But there was something about the stillness outside that stopped her. It felt wrong. Before she could think it through, another knock sounded, louder this time, as though whatever was on the other side was growing impatient. She had no choice. Slowly she turned the handle. The door creaked open with a groan that seemed too loud in the quiet of the night. The air outside was thick with the smell of wet leaves, the cool breeze brushing against her face, but there was no one in sight. No one standing on the porch. Her eyes scanned the darkness, the porch light casting long shadows across the front yard. Was it a prank? Maybe some teenagers messing around. But then why wasn't there anyone visible? She stepped outside, squinting into the dark. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing she could hear now. A low, unsettling whisper that made her feel even more isolated. Then she saw it. At the edge of the porch, barely visible in the dim light, there was someone. A figure standing just out of the light's reach. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it a person? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, staring at her. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No answer. She took a step forward, the gravel crunching beneath her feet. The figure still didn't move, didn't respond. But there was something about the stillness that unnerved her more than anything. It was like it was waiting, watching her. The air grew colder. A sudden chill ran down her spine. She felt a surge of fear rush through her. Why was it so cold? Why was this person just standing there, not speaking, not moving? Another step. And then something unexpected happened. The figure raised a hand, slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. What did it want? What was it doing? But then, just as suddenly as it had raised its hand, the figure turned and disappeared into the night, vanishing into the darkness like smoke on the wind. She stood frozen, unable to comprehend what she had just seen. Had she imagined it? It couldn't be real. But then she heard it again. A soft knock at the door. This time she didn't hesitate. She bolted inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The sound of the knocking stopped, but the feeling didn't. That feeling of being watched, of being followed, was still there, hanging in the air like a thick fog. What had just happened? Who had been on her doorstep? And why did it feel like this night was just beginning? She glanced around the house, feeling the walls close in. What was out there waiting for her? And why had it come now? Asterisk, asterisk. Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The bed, once a sanctuary of comfort, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, sent her heart racing. She kept her eyes fixed on the ceiling, her thoughts tangled in a web of uncertainty. What had she seen? Was it a prank? A figment of her imagination, born from the silence and the isolation of the house? She tried to rationalize it, to convince herself it wasn't real. But something about the figure on her doorstep, standing motionless in the darkness, gnawed at her. The knock. The way it had come, soft, then loud, then the figure that had appeared just beyond the porch light. There was no explanation. No reason why someone would stand in the shadows like that and just wait. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand. 3:45 a.m. It had been hours since she had heard the knock. The house was still, too still. The kind of stillness that made her feel as though she were the only person left in the world. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every corner seemed to hide something more sinister. The quiet felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. A sudden noise broke her from her thoughts. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from the direction of the window. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up, her eyes darting toward the sound, her body frozen in place. It was a cat. A cat, she told herself. Just a cat. But the scratching didn't stop. It was getting louder. More frantic. More insistent. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Sarah swung her legs off the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She slowly walked to the window, her pulse racing with every step. She reached the curtains and hesitated. Was it the wind? Was it really just a cat? With a shaking hand, she pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The yard was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon. No cat. No figure. Just the empty space she had seen earlier. She exhaled, a rush of relief flooding through her. It was just her nerves, nothing more. But as she began to turn away from the window, something caught her eye. A shadow. It was moving. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but then it shifted again. There, in the corner of her yard, a dark shape was moving. It was too far to make out any details, but there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was standing in her yard, watching her. She stepped back from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. No, this couldn't be happening. Her mind raced. Could it be the same person from earlier? Had they come back? But why? Why were they watching her? The shadow moved again, closer this time. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she backed away from the window, her legs trembling beneath her. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just the wind playing tricks on her again, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The knock, the figure, and now this. It was too much. Too many things didn't add up. She had to do something. She glanced over at the phone on her bedside table. Could she call the police? But for what? A shadow in her yard? It sounded ridiculous even to her own ears. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it. She hesitated, staring at the screen. What could she say? How could she explain the unease that was crawling up her spine without sounding insane? As she scrolled through her contacts, the scratching sound returned, but this time it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from inside the house, from the walls. Her breath caught. She slowly set the phone down and moved toward the door of her room, listening intently. The sound was faint, but it was unmistakable. Something was scratching at the walls. Something was trying to get in. She approached the hallway cautiously, her footsteps soft on the floor. As she stepped into the hallway, the scratching grew louder. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the attic. She froze. The attic. Her heart pounded in her chest. The attic was sealed. She hadn't been up there in years. She had no choice. She had to check. Every step toward the attic door felt like an eternity. The air grew heavier, colder. The house seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. The scratching was louder now, frantic. It was almost as if whatever was up there was desperate to get out. With one hand on the doorknob, Sarah felt a surge of terror wash over her. The door to the attic creaked open. She stood there, staring into the darkness. And then silence. The scratching stopped. The house was eerily quiet once again. She held her breath. Should she go up? Should she call someone? But what if it wasn't just a sound? What if something was really up there? Her heart raced in her chest as she reached for the stairs leading to the attic. She stepped up, 1 foot at a time, each step echoing through the silence of the house. The closer she got to the top, the stronger the feeling of dread became. It was like something was waiting for her, watching her. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, like an unseen hand clutching at her heart. She reached the top of the stairs and paused. The attic door was slightly ajar, as if someone, or something, had been inside recently. And then, from the darkness beyond, she heard it. A low, guttural growl. Her blood ran cold. What was up there? And why was it making that sound? Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen at the top of the attic stairs. The low growl echoed in the darkness beyond, sending a jolt of pure fear through her body. The growl wasn't from an animal. It was something deeper, something far more unsettling. Her hand gripped the doorframe as she tried to steady herself. The attic was the last place she wanted to be, especially at this hour, alone in a house that felt more like a haunted shell than a home. But something in the pit of her stomach, told her that she had no choice but to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. The attic was pitch black, save for a faint glimmer of moonlight filtering through the small, grimy window. The shadows in the corners stretched out like tendrils, reaching into the dark, waiting for her to come closer. Another growl. This one was louder, angrier, more desperate. It made her blood run cold, her pulse racing with each passing second. Was it a person? A creature? What could make a sound like that? She backed away, nearly stumbling down the stairs, but then something inside her snapped. She couldn't keep running, couldn't hide from whatever this was. It was here and it was waiting. It wanted her to be afraid. With a deep breath, she stepped forward again, this time more determined. She had to know what was making that noise. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the attic stairs as she slowly ascended. Every step creaked loudly beneath her weight, the sound of her footfalls magnified in the otherwise silent house. She was too aware of the fact that she was no longer alone. There was something up there, and it was waiting for her. When she reached the top, she paused, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The attic door was open, just a crack, but enough for her to hear the low growl again. She couldn't stay down here. She had to see it. She had to know what it was. With a quick breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick, musty, and stale, like no one had been up there in years. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the room, and old, forgotten boxes were scattered everywhere, some tipped over as if something had been rummaging through them. The only light came from the small window on the far wall, casting eerie shadows across the attic. Then her eyes locked onto something, someone, in the far corner. A figure. It was hunched, crouching low to the ground, almost too still. The silhouette was distorted, as if its body wasn't quite right. Sarah's stomach twisted with dread as her gaze traced the figure's outline. It was wrong. Its arms were too long, its legs bent at unnatural angles. The growling sound was coming from it, vibrating through the floor beneath her. The figure suddenly stopped, its head jerking up to face her. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing faintly red. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat as her mind screamed for her to turn and run, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. It was like the creature was pulling her in, drawing her into its gaze, into its terror. Her heart thudded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears as the creature slowly stood, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was taller now, towering over her. The growl deepened, turning into something far more primal, more terrifying. Its mouth opened, showing sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with something that wasn't quite saliva. Before she could react, the creature lunged at her, and she screamed, stumbling back toward the stairs. She barely managed to catch herself before tumbling down, her mind clouded with panic, her heart racing in her chest. The creature didn't chase her. It stayed in the attic, watching her from the shadows. Sarah slammed the attic door shut, her breath coming in quick, panicked bursts. She backed away, shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? What was that thing? Her mind raced, but she couldn't make sense of it. It didn't look human. It didn't look like anything she'd ever seen before. And yet, she knew in the deepest part of her soul that it was real. Suddenly, the house felt even darker, colder. The air seemed thicker, pressing in on her from all sides. She ran down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the house as she tried to escape the suffocating terror closing in on her. Her hands fumbled with the door, her fingers numb with fear as she tried to unlock it. But the door wouldn't budge. She yanked at the knob, her panic rising, but the door remained firmly shut. She turned to look at the windows. They were locked too. The house was trapping her. Then the growl came again. This time it was closer. Sarah spun around, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She was cornered. There was nowhere to run. She heard the sound of something shifting behind her. She didn't dare turn around. She couldn't. But she knew. She knew it was there. Her thoughts were a blur of fear. The creature from the attic had followed her down. It had to have. And now it was in the house. She was no longer alone. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the unsettling noise that filled the silence of the house. The faint scratching, a soft tapping at first, then a shuffle, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming from behind her, getting closer. She turned, her mind screaming for her to move, but her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot by pure terror. The house, once a place she thought was safe, now felt like a tomb, the walls closing in with every passing second. Every creak, every breath of wind outside, seemed to magnify the fear inside her. The door wouldn't open. The windows were locked. She was trapped. And whatever was behind her, whatever had been waiting in the darkness, was closer than ever. Her pulse quickened as she slowly turned her head, dreading what she might see. And then there it was, standing in the doorway. The figure. It had moved so silently, so quickly, she hadn't heard it. But now it was there. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, like two red embers burning in the night. It was taller than before, its body more elongated and distorted. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there watching her, its eyes never leaving hers. Sarah could feel its gaze piercing through her, as though it could see every thought, every fear buried deep inside her. It was as if it was feeding off her terror. She tried to back away, but her legs wouldn't obey. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the thing standing in front of her. It seemed to sway, its limbs bending in unnatural ways as if it wasn't fully in this world. The growl, low and rumbling, filled the room again. But this time it wasn't coming from its throat. No, it came from its chest, vibrating through the very air around her. "Why are you here?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The creature tilted its head as if considering her question. Then it took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath its weight. The sound sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, and she instinctively stepped back, her foot hitting the edge of the couch behind her. It didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Its eyes were enough. They glowed brighter now, and Sarah could feel the overwhelming pressure of its presence. Suddenly the room went cold. The temperature dropped so quickly that she could see her breath misting in the air. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow darker, and the air itself felt thick, almost suffocating. It was as if the creature was drawing the life out of the room, draining it piece by piece. Sarah's hand shot out toward the nearby bookshelf, grabbing for anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers brushed against an old, heavy book. She didn't care what it was, she just needed something. As she raised the book, ready to strike, the creature let out a sharp hiss, its body jerking forward with unnatural speed. It was too fast. Before she could react, it was inches from her face, its red eyes burning into hers. Her breath caught in her throat and she dropped the book in shock, too terrified to move. It was close now, so close that she could feel its cold breath on her skin. The growl became louder, deeper, more intense. It was all around her now, like a weight pressing on her chest. And then, with one swift motion, the creature reached out. Its hand, if it could even be called that, was long, thin, and clawed. It grasped her arm, its grip freezing, and yanked her toward it. A jolt of cold spread through her body as she struggled to free herself. Her feet left the ground for a brief moment as she was pulled toward the creature. She felt its claws digging into her skin, its grip unyielding. "You shouldn't have come here," the creature whispered, its voice like gravel, like something scraping against metal. Sarah's blood ran cold. The voice didn't come from its mouth, but from somewhere inside her own mind. It was as if the words were being whispered directly into her thoughts. "No, no, let me go," she screamed, twisting and fighting, but it was no use. The creature's strength was unimaginable. It was as if she were fighting against a force of nature itself. It dragged her closer, and as she was pulled into its embrace, she felt the cold of its body seep into her very bones. The room around her blurred, the shadows stretching and warping as if the world itself was bending under the weight of the creature's presence. She felt it now, its mind, its thoughts pressing against hers. It wasn't just a creature. It was something else. Something ancient. Something beyond understanding. Suddenly everything went black. The darkness was suffocating. It pressed in on Sarah from all sides, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Her body felt weightless, as if she was floating in a void, but her mind was alert, screaming, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her eyes snapped open and she gasped for air. She was no longer in the living room, no longer in the house she had known. Instead, she found herself in a place that was both familiar and alien at the same time, a place that felt like it was born from her worst fears. It was a long hallway, but it stretched endlessly, the walls lined with old rotting wood that seemed to whisper. The floor beneath her feet was cold and cracked, and the dim light from flickering sconces barely illuminated the path ahead. The air was thick with dust and something else, something darker, something foul. She stumbled to her feet, her legs weak, still trembling from her earlier encounter. She didn't know how she had gotten here. One moment she was fighting for her life, struggling against the creature's grip, and the next she was here, in this twisted version of reality. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was this a dream? A hallucination? No, this felt too real. The coldness that gnawed at her bones, the oppressive silence that hung heavy in the air, it was all too tangible. As she began to walk down the hallway, each step felt heavier than the last. The floor creaked under her feet, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness around her. The walls seemed to close in, pressing tighter with every move. There was no escape, no way out. She could hear something, though faint whispers, soft and unintelligible. Were they coming from the walls? Or was it her mind playing tricks on her? Then the whispers grew louder. "Sarah?" The voice was low, breathy, like a wind that carried words through a storm. She spun around, but there was no one there. "Sarah?" It called her name again, but this time it was clearer, more distinct. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Her eyes darted down the hallway, searching for any sign of movement. But everything was still, just as silent as before. The whispers were gone, leaving only a deafening silence in their wake. But something felt different now. The very air felt alive with a dark presence. The walls felt like they were breathing, shifting, moving in ways that didn't make sense. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She took another step, but this time the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. A low groan echoed through the floor, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. It was followed by the sound of something dragging, slow and deliberate. She stopped. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the noise. What was it? What was dragging itself through the floor? She glanced back, her eyes scanning the hallway behind her. Nothing. But the dragging sound, it was getting closer. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the noise was moving toward her. It was unmistakable now, the sound of something or someone crawling across the floor, dragging itself forward with horrible persistence. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She had to move. She had to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, the floor seemed to tilt, and the dragging sound grew louder, more urgent. She turned to face the darkness ahead, but before she could take a step, she saw it, something crawling from the shadows. A figure. It was low to the ground, its limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. Its body was stretched, elongated, and it crawled with an unsettling speed. Its face, or what was left of it, was barely recognizable, distorted, stretched, and covered in dark, oozing wounds. And its eyes. The creature's eyes were wide open, glowing with a sickly yellow light. They locked onto Sarah, and in that moment she knew it was coming for her. Without thinking, she ran. She didn't care which way she was going. She didn't care about anything except getting away from that thing. Her feet pounded against the cold floor as she sprinted down the hallway, the dragging sound growing louder with each passing second. She glanced back once. The creature was still there, still crawling, still following. She turned a corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly in her chest that she could barely hear anything else. But the sound of the creature's movements filled her ears, the dragging growing closer, closer with every step. The hallway stretched on endlessly, each turn leading to more darkness, more silence. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stop running. She had to get away. And then the floor beneath her feet gave way. She screamed as she fell, her body plunging into the darkness below. She hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact jarring her entire body. The world spun around her, and for a moment, everything went dark. When she finally managed to open her eyes, she found herself in a different place, a different part of the house. But it wasn't the house she had known. The walls were cracked, stained, and covered in strange symbols. The air smelled of rot, and the floor was slick with something cold and sticky. And then she heard it, the growl. It was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. The creature was there, standing in the doorway, and it was smiling. The smile on the creature's face sent a chill down Sarah's spine, so deep she thought her bones would crack from the cold. It was a grin, twisted and wrong, stretching across its face in a grotesque parody of something human. The creature didn't speak, it didn't need to. Its eyes, glowing with that sickly yellow light, locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. She couldn't breathe. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to flee before the thing came any closer, but her legs felt like lead, frozen in place. It took another step and then another. Each step it took toward her was like a drumbeat in the silence, each one louder than the last. Sarah's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but the walls closed in around her, as if the very house was conspiring against her. The creature's smile grew wider. "I see you," it whispered, its voice a low rasp that seemed to reverberate inside her skull. She shuddered, every nerve in her body screaming in terror. "I see what you fear." The words cut through her like a knife. How could it know? How could it possibly know the depths of her fear? "Please, please don't," she whispered, her voice barely a sound, barely audible even to her own ears. But the creature didn't stop. It was moving closer now, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in her chest. "You think you can hide from me?" the creature crooned, its voice seeping into her mind like poison. "You think this is just a nightmare?" Its hand reached out, fingers elongated, sharp claws glinting in the dim light. Sarah staggered back, but she hit the wall behind her with a sickening thud. The room seemed to shrink around her. She had no place to go and no way to escape. The creature was almost upon her now, its rancid breath hot on her skin. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, and with it, the pressure in the air increased, suffocating her, choking her. It felt like the walls were closing in, crushing her beneath the weight of her own fear. And then, silence. The creature froze. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was happening? Was it finally going to speak? But before she could think another thought, the room around her began to shift. The floor trembled beneath her feet, and the walls seemed to warp and stretch, bending and twisting like a funhouse mirror. The very fabric of reality itself was breaking apart. And then from the darkness, a voice that wasn't the creature's, spoke. "Leave her alone." The words rang out, sharp and clear, cutting through the suffocating silence. Sarah whipped her head around, looking for the source of the voice. But there was no one. Just the shifting shadows and the unbearable weight of the creature's presence. The creature recoiled, its twisted face contorting in confusion. "No. No one has ever spoken to me like that before," it growled. It was a strange thing to hear the creature sound so uncertain. And then a figure appeared. It was tall, shrouded in a cloak of dark shadows, its face hidden beneath the folds of its hood. But Sarah could feel its presence, powerful and overwhelming like a force of nature. The creature, the thing that had tormented her, took a step back as if afraid of this new arrival. "I am not finished with her," the creature snarled, its voice growing deeper, more furious. "You are," the figure said, its voice calm, yet filled with an undeniable authority. "And you will leave her be." Sarah's heart raced. Who was this? What was happening? The creature hissed, the sound of its fury like nails scraping against metal. But still it did not move. The figure's presence was enough to hold it at bay. For a moment the world seemed to stop. The creature, frozen in place, its burning eyes still locked on Sarah, the figure standing tall and resolute in front of her, shielding her from whatever darkness had claimed the house. "I have seen your fear," the figure said softly, its voice carrying an ancient weight. "But fear does not control you. It only blinds you." The creature growled, its claws twitching as if preparing to strike. But the figure raised a hand, and the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. "You will not touch her," the figure said, its voice now a force that reverberated through the room. The creature's eyes widened. "No one can stop me. I am the darkness itself." The figure did not flinch. "The darkness you are is nothing compared to the light you are blind to." With that, the figure raised both hands, and the shadows in the room seemed to convulse, writhing as if in agony. The very walls seemed to shrink back from the power emanating from the figure, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt the weight of the fear that had crushed her lift, like a fog dispersing in the dawn. The creature screeched, a sound that rattled Sarah's bones, but it did not move. It seemed to be trapped, held by some unseen force. Then, the figure turned to Sarah, and for the first time since she had entered the nightmare, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. "You have strength within you," the figure said, its voice soft yet powerful. "You must remember that. Even when the darkness calls, you must stand." With a final glance at the creature, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. The creature let out one last desperate cry before it too vanished into the void. The silence after the creature's disappearance was deafening. Sarah stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the lingering echo of the creature's screech still ringing in her ears. It felt like the very air itself had thickened, pressing in on her, suffocating her with its stillness. She couldn't make sense of what had just happened. One moment she was facing certain death, and the next she was left in the eerie calm of an empty room. Her hands trembled as she reached for the wall to steady herself. The shadows, once so oppressive, had faded, but the sense of unease lingered, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Sarah's mind was spinning. What had just saved her? Who was that figure? And where had the creature gone? She took a step forward, glancing around the room. The walls were cracked, but not as badly as they had been before. The symbols that had covered them were now faint, like they were fading from existence, erasing their hold on this place. It was as if the house itself was starting to come undone, like a puzzle being pulled apart by some unseen force. But as much as she wanted to believe she was safe, she knew better. The creature was still out there. It hadn't truly left. It had only been driven away for a moment. And what about that figure? The one who had stepped in to protect her? Who were they? Was it someone or something that had come to fight the darkness on her behalf? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't understanding, something vital she had yet to figure out. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the center of the room. It was now empty, save for a few scattered pieces of debris, but there was something in the air that told her she wasn't alone. The silence was too heavy, too oppressive. Her senses were on high alert, every nerve firing as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Then she saw it. A faint, glowing light appeared in the far corner of the room. It flickered like a candle flame, but it wasn't a flame. It was something else. Something unnatural. The light seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own. Without thinking, Sarah moved toward it, her feet taking her forward, step by cautious step. The closer she got, the more intense the light became, filling the room with an otherworldly glow. It was both beautiful and horrifying, like a beacon that promised both safety and doom. As she reached out toward the light, she felt a sudden shift in the air. The temperature dropped, and the room seemed to darken again, the shadows creeping back in, swirling like they had a mind of their own. And then a voice, familiar yet twisted, whispered from the darkness. "Did you think you could escape me?" It was the creature's voice. Sarah froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She had thought she was safe. She had believed that the figure had banished the creature, but she was wrong. It was still here, lurking, waiting. "Did you really think this was over?" the voice asked again, its tone mocking, taunting. Sarah spun around, her eyes searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing. The shadows were empty, the room silent again. But the creature's presence was unmistakable now. She could feel it like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. It was close. Too close. The glowing light in front of her flickered again, as if responding to the creature's presence. It was like the light itself was struggling, caught between two forces, one of darkness and one of something else. Something that Sarah couldn't quite comprehend. And then the light began to grow. It expanded rapidly, flooding the room with blinding brightness, pushing back the shadows, pushing back the creature. The walls seemed to bend and warp with the intensity of the light. The room pulsed, vibrating with a strange energy, and Sarah could feel it all around her, pulling her in, filling her with something she couldn't describe. Something ancient, something powerful. Her heart raced. She knew this was no ordinary light. It wasn't just a beacon of hope. It was something far more complicated, something tied to the very nature of this house, this twisted reality. The creature screeched again, a sound that tore at Sarah's eardrums, but it was drowned out by the growing intensity of the light. She shielded her eyes, trying to block out the searing brightness, but it was impossible. The light was everywhere now, filling every inch of the room, pushing the darkness away, but also pushing something else. The room around her seemed to fragment, like the edges of a broken mirror, splintering into pieces that couldn't hold together. The air grew thick, charged with electricity. And then, in the center of the room, the figure appeared again. But this time it was different. It was clearer, more defined. The shadows that had cloaked it were gone, replaced by an aura of light that surrounded it like a halo. "You cannot hide from the truth," the figure said, its voice strong and unwavering. "The darkness will always return, but you must choose what you will become." Sarah's mind reeled. What did that mean? What truth? What was she supposed to become? Before she could ask, the light around her intensified once more, and the world seemed to fracture. The room, the house, everything around her shattered like glass, scattering into nothingness. And then there was silence. The silence was suffocating, thick like the air in a tomb, pressing down on Sarah as if the very atmosphere around her had become a living, breathing entity. It was as though the world had ceased to exist, leaving her suspended in an eerie, inescapable void. She blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of her surroundings. There was nothing, no walls, no floor beneath her feet, no ceiling above. Just an endless expanse of darkness. Where had the house gone? The creature? The figure that had come to her aid? All gone like they had never existed at all. The overwhelming emptiness that surrounded her was more terrifying than any monster could ever be. Sarah's breaths came in shallow gasps, her chest tightening as her mind raced to comprehend the situation. Was she dreaming? Had she somehow entered another realm? Nothing made sense, and yet, the more she tried to reason with herself, the more confused she became. She looked down at her hands, clenching them into fists. The fear in her gut threatened to overtake her, but she forced herself to steady her breathing. She had to find a way out. This void, This space couldn't be all there was. Something had to be out there. Something that could explain what had happened to the world she had known. And then she saw it. At first, it was a mere flicker, an unnatural glow on the horizon, too faint to be real. But as she focused her gaze, the light began to grow, expanding outward, its source becoming more defined. It wasn't like any light she had ever seen before. It wasn't warm or comforting. It was cold, almost metallic, and it pulsed rhythmically as though it had a heartbeat of its own. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the light despite every instinct telling her to turn back. The fear that had gripped her was still there, gnawing at her insides, but the light, it was something she couldn't ignore. There was a strange pull to it, an undeniable attraction that urged her forward, compelling her to close the distance between them. Each step she took felt like a lifetime, as if she were walking on a surface that was about to collapse beneath her feet. The sensation of uncertainty clawed at her, but still she kept going. The light was closer now, so close she could almost reach out and touch it. And yet, even as it neared, the fear didn't dissipate. In fact, it grew. Because now she could see that it wasn't just a light, it was something else, something far darker. In the center of the glowing expanse, an archway began to form, like a doorway made of pure light. It shimmered and flickered, its edges dancing with energy, crackling and sparking as though it were alive. Sarah stopped, suddenly aware of the weight of the decision she had just made. The fear that had once seemed distant now rushed back, flooding her senses like a tidal wave. What was this place? What was beyond the arch? Was this a doorway to salvation, or was it something much worse? Her heart raced as the air around her thickened, the vibrations intensifying. She could feel the presence of something watching her, something beyond her comprehension. It wasn't the creature that had haunted her, but it was something more ancient, something more primal. She couldn't explain it, but it felt as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart around her. "Step through," a voice whispered from the shadows. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, echoing in her mind, reverberating through her soul. It was soft at first, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it, something that made her blood run cold. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who was speaking? Was it the creature, the one who had tormented her? Or was it something else entirely? "Step through and you will understand," the voice continued, its tone coaxing, urging. It seemed to fill the air, wrapping around her, pulling at her thoughts like strings on a puppet. It wasn't just a voice, it was a force, and Sarah felt it tugging at her, inviting her to surrender to it. But she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. She wasn't sure she wanted to know what lay beyond that arch. She stepped back, hesitating for just a moment, but then the light pulsed again, growing brighter, stronger. It was impossible to ignore now, pulling at her with a gravitational force that she couldn't resist. There was something deeply wrong about this place, and yet, Sarah couldn't turn away. Something inside her told her that if she didn't cross that threshold, if she didn't step through that arch, she would never know what truly happened. She would be stuck, lost forever. With a shaky breath, she reached out toward the arch. Her fingers brushed the edge of the glowing light, and the world around her seemed to collapse. The moment she touched it, an overwhelming force slammed into her, pushing her forward. The ground disappeared beneath her feet, and the air seemed to fold in on itself. There was no longer any distinction between up and down, left or right. It was as if she was falling through the very fabric of the universe itself, tumbling endlessly into a void that had no beginning and no end. The rush of energy was blinding, suffocating. The light around her grew so intense, so sharp, that it felt as though her skin was being burned. The air seemed to vibrate with power, buzzing like 1,000 bees swarming around her, stinging her with their presence. But she couldn't pull away. She couldn't stop. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The light vanished. The buzzing faded. And Sarah was left standing, floating, in complete darkness. The void around Sarah was oppressive, crushing her from all sides, and yet she could not feel the weight of it. It was as though she were suspended in time, caught between worlds, unable to move forward or back. Her body felt like it was no longer her own, a hollow shell adrift in the nothingness. She tried to breathe, but the air, if it could even be called air, was thick and dry, like dust that had settled in the corners of an ancient room long forgotten. Her chest tightened as panic began to rise within her. The complete absence of sound, no hum, no whisper of movement, not even the slightest shift in the atmosphere, made her feel even more isolated, more alone. What had happened? Where was she? Had the portal, had it brought her here? Questions flooded her mind, too many to make sense of, each one more terrifying than the last. She couldn't see anything, couldn't feel anything solid around her. It was as if she were drifting in an endless sea of nothingness, a dark void that stretched forever in every direction. Her body seemed to tingle with the energy that had surged through her when she stepped into the light, but it was no comfort. It felt alien, like it didn't belong to her. And then she heard something. A sound. Faint at first, like the distant whisper of wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. The soft, echoing thump of something heavy hitting the ground. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze. Was it real? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? The thumping came again. Closer this time. It reverberated through the emptiness, shaking her very core. She held her breath, waiting, straining her ears. What was it? What was out there? Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before. Sarah's mind raced. Should she run? Should she hide? But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. There was only the blackness, the cold, and the growing uncertainty of what was to come. She tried to move, to take a step forward, but her legs felt like lead. Her body refused to cooperate, as though some unseen force was holding her back. Panic began to claw at her chest, a suffocating wave of fear that made her feel like she was drowning in it. What was happening to her? Was she trapped here? Was this some kind of nightmare she couldn't escape? Another sound, closer now. It wasn't a thump this time, but something else. A soft scraping noise like metal against stone. The sound was unnerving, as if something, or someone, was moving through the dark just out of her sight. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she turned her head, desperately searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only the endless, oppressive blackness. And then, just as she was beginning to lose all hope of ever escaping, a figure appeared before her. It was a shadow at first, just a vague outline against the darkness, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. A shape, a human figure, but not quite. The edges were blurred, distorted, as though the figure itself was not fully part of this world. It seemed to flicker, its form wavering like a mirage on the edge of her vision. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body remained paralyzed. The figure reached out toward her, its hand, if it could even be called a hand, growing larger and more defined as it drew nearer. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was this it? Was this the end? Do not be afraid, the voice whispered. But it wasn't a voice that comforted her. It was cold, hollow, the words scraping against her soul like shards of glass. She stumbled backward, trying to break free from the grip of whatever was holding her in place, but she couldn't. The darkness around her seemed to close in, pressing down on her with unbearable force. The figure moved closer, its presence looming, the air around it vibrating with an unnatural energy. I have been waiting for you, the figure said, its voice now so close that it felt like it was inside her mind. Waiting for me? Sarah gasped, her voice a whisper. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. It felt like her very existence was being consumed by its presence. The figure's form flickered again, and for a split second, Sarah could swear she saw its face. A face twisted with sorrow and rage, eyes black as coal, hollowed out and filled with darkness. A face she had seen before, or at least something similar. But before she could make sense of it, the image vanished, replaced by the cold, empty void once more. You are part of this now, the figure continued, its tone flat and emotionless. There is no escape. You belong to it. The words pierced her like a knife, and a wave of terror washed over her. Escape? What did it mean? What was she a part of? I don't understand, Sarah stammered, struggling to find her voice. You will, the figure replied, its form beginning to fade, the edges of it disintegrating into the shadows. Soon enough, and with that it was gone. Sarah was left standing in the darkness once more, her mind reeling. What had just happened? Who was that? What did it mean? She felt more lost than ever, more confused and terrified. But one thing was certain. The figure's words echoed in her mind like a haunting mantra. You belong to it. Sarah was frozen in place, her mind racing to process the encounter. Her thoughts collided with one another like a jumble of chaotic whispers. The figure's words echoed in her ears, each syllable digging deeper into her chest. "You belong to it," she repeated it over and over in her head, trying to make sense of it, but the more she thought about it, the less clear everything became. What had she just witnessed? That thing, that shadow. Who was it? What did it mean by saying she belonged to it? Her body felt heavy, as though the very air around her was pulling her down. She could no longer tell if time was passing. It felt like minutes, hours, or perhaps even days had gone by since the encounter, but the darkness hadn't changed. The void around her was still just as oppressive, still just as suffocating. The only difference now was that her sense of fear had grown even more intense, more consuming. The weight of it threatened to crush her entirely. Every corner of her mind screamed for an answer, for a reason to explain why she was here, why all of this was happening. But no matter how much she searched, there were no answers, only more questions that only seemed to lead to darker paths. She tried to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her sides. But she couldn't focus. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the figure, the flickering form, the voice. It had felt wrong, unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. And yet, the voice had been so calm, so sure, as if it knew something she didn't, something she was meant to understand, but didn't. "You belong to it," the words rang in her ears again, louder this time, reverberating like the sound of a distant drumbeat. She felt it deep inside of her. The truth that the figure had spoken. But what did it mean? How could she belong to something like that? And if she did, what would happen to her? Panic surged through her veins once again. She looked around, desperate for something, anything that would explain what was going on. But all she could see was the same all-encompassing darkness, the same unbroken void that stretched forever in every direction. A low hum began to rise in the air. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it quickly grew louder, filling the space around her. The sound was unnatural, mechanical in its consistency, like the hum of a machine that had been running for too long. It vibrated through her chest, rattling her bones with its steady rhythm. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She turned in the direction of the noise, hoping, praying, that something, anything, would appear in the darkness. And then, slowly, the outline of a figure began to take shape, moving through the blackness toward her. It wasn't the same shadow she had seen before. This was different, more solid, more defined. It was like a person, but its features were blurry, shifting as though it were made of smoke. The more Sarah focused on it, the more it seemed to bend and warp, its shape constantly in flux. It was almost like a mirage, something that wasn't quite real. Her pulse quickened. Was this another one of those things? Another entity from the void? Was this the thing that the figure had warned her about, the force that she had supposedly become a part of? But before she could make sense of it, the figure stopped in front of her, just out of arm's reach. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying her. Its movement was fluid, almost graceful, and yet there was something unsettling about it, something in the way it didn't quite belong in the space it occupied. "I see you're still here," the figure said, its voice quiet but piercing. There was something familiar about it, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. "What are you?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. She was scared, terrified even, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer right away. It simply stood there, its form rippling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. Then, after a long pause, it spoke again, its voice no longer calm or emotionless. This time there was a touch of something else, something colder, darker. "You are not the first to find yourself in this place," it said, its tone almost mocking. "But you are the first to be chosen." "Chosen?" Sarah repeated, her heart pounding in her chest. "Chosen for what?" The figure's features warped again, twisting and distorting like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. It leaned closer to her, and for the first time, Sarah saw its eyes. Black as night. Empty, hollow, as though they had never seen the light of day. "You will see soon enough," it whispered. "Everything you are, everything you have known, it will be remade." Before Sarah could respond, the figure began to fade, its form disintegrating into wisps of smoke that evaporated into the void. It was gone, leaving her alone once again, but the air felt different now. Heavier, colder. She could almost feel the presence of something more. Something larger, more menacing, lingering just beyond her reach. Her head spun. Her body felt numb, like it was losing its connection to reality. She wanted to scream, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was her prison, and now it felt like the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The words the figure had spoken clung to her like a weight. You are the first to be chosen. Chosen for what? What did it mean for her? What would become of her now? Sarah didn't know how much longer she could stand this. The fear gnawed at her, an ever-present gnawing that threatened to overwhelm her completely. She needed answers. She needed to understand. But the longer she remained in this place, the more she realized answers were the last thing she would find here. The void had its own rules, its own desires. And whatever fate had in store for her, she was about to find out. The sensation of weightlessness slowly began to fade, and with it, a sense of dreadful anticipation settled in Sarah's chest. She had no idea how long she'd been suspended in the void. The darkness had become so familiar, yet the dread inside her grew by the second, like a creeping tide of cold, threatening to drown her whole. The encounter with the figure had only deepened the confusion. You are not the first to find yourself in this place, it had said. But you are the first to be chosen. Chosen for what? Her mind couldn't piece it together. The words circled in her thoughts, taunting her with their mystery. She had been drifting aimlessly for what felt like an eternity. She couldn't tell how long it had been since the figure disappeared into the air, leaving only a sense of its cold presence in her mind. It was as if the very air around her was charged with something, some unseen force that made her skin crawl. The weight of its absence only made the silence more deafening. Every direction felt the same. There was no landmark, no sign of anything solid, tangible. No ground beneath her feet. Sarah's feet felt like they were barely touching the ground, if there even was one. She couldn't tell. The emptiness of the place was disorienting, twisting her sense of reality, bending it in ways she couldn't understand. How could she even be here? She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to be brought to this nightmarish place. But there was something she couldn't ignore, a nagging pull deep inside her chest, a sensation like a cold hand pressing against her ribs, squeezing tighter with every passing moment. It was familiar, this feeling. She had felt it before. A warning, a reminder. The fear that had initially gripped her had shifted. Now it wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was something else, something darker. The uncertainty of what came next was like a storm cloud on the horizon, growing closer with every beat of her heart. The figure's words were burned into her mind, but it was the one question that clung to her thoughts, the one question that refused to leave her alone. What was she chosen for? Her legs felt shaky, as though her body wasn't sure if it wanted to stand or run. Run from what, though? The empty void? The mysterious force that had brought her here? Or the chilling reminder that whatever happened, she couldn't escape it? The fear that had only intensified since she had stepped into this place. A sudden, piercing shriek shattered the silence, ripping through the stillness like a knife cutting through fabric. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she instinctively recoiled, her eyes darting around, but there was nothing, nothing at all. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment before it was swallowed by the ever-pressing darkness. Was that real? Or was it just her mind playing tricks on her? She couldn't tell anymore. The boundaries of what was real and what wasn't had become so blurred, she wasn't sure what to believe. But she wasn't alone. She knew she wasn't alone. The way the darkness felt around her, its oppressive weight, told her she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The unmistakable feeling of eyes on her made the air around her feel thick, suffocating. But when she turned her head, there was nothing. Only the same empty void. Another scream. This time closer. And it wasn't just a shriek. It was a cry of pain, of fear. A human cry. A voice, distorted, broken, echoing through the void. She knew that voice. "Tom," she whispered, her heart racing. Her breath caught in her throat as memories of him flashed before her eyes. Tom, her older brother. The one who had always been there for her. The one who had protected her. The one who had disappeared all those years ago without a trace. Could it be him? Was it possible? The thought sent a chill running through her spine. She had never believed in ghosts or spirits, but this felt different. It felt too real, too alive, even in a place like this. She stepped forward, the air around her growing heavier with each step. It felt wrong, unnatural, as though she was walking through an invisible barrier that pressed against her every movement. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't shake the feeling that Tom, her brother, was somewhere in this darkness. She needed to find him. She had to. The cries continued, echoing through the void. They grew louder now, but more distant, as though Tom's voice was moving farther away. Or was it something else? Something that was keeping her from reaching him? She didn't know. Her feet moved on their own accord, urging her to follow the sound, to chase it through the oppressive void that threatened to swallow her whole. But with each step, the voice faded, the distance growing. "Tom, please," she thought. "Where are you?" The cries stopped abruptly, leaving only silence in their wake. The sudden absence of sound left her reeling. For a moment, she thought she might lose her balance, her mind spinning, disoriented. Had she imagined it all? Was she losing her grip on reality? But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A flicker. A tiny speck of light in the distance, cutting through the eternal blackness. It was faint, but it was there. Her heart leaped in her chest, and she didn't hesitate. Without thinking, without even questioning the impulse, she began to move toward it. The light grew larger with every step she took. It didn't flicker or fade. It remained steady, a beacon in the darkness, guiding her forward. But the closer she got, the more unsettling it became. The light wasn't warm. It wasn't comforting. It was cold, sharp, like the gleam of a knife in the night. And as Sarah neared it, she saw something she wasn't prepared for. A figure. A shadow. Standing in the light. Its form was indistinct, shifting like the figure she had seen before. But this one was different. It wasn't flickering like smoke. It was solid. Real. And its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared back at her with such intense, terrifying focus that her blood turned to ice. Sarah stopped in her tracks. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching her. Its presence radiated something dark, something that made her feel like she was being pulled toward it, even though every part of her screamed to run in the opposite direction. The light continued to grow brighter, yet the figure didn't step out of it. It stayed there, its form unwavering, a perfect contradiction to the warmth that should have been there. She didn't know why, but she couldn't look away. There was something compelling about it, something that anchored her to the spot, like the pull of a gravity she couldn't fight. And then a voice, low, guttural, spoke from the figure, a voice that sounded like it was made of the very shadows surrounding them. "You're too late," it whispered, its words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You can't save him." Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the world around her seemed to shudder. Was it talking about Tom? The voice, was it the same one she had heard crying out? Was it warning her or mocking her? A cold chill ran down her spine. She had to act. She had to move. But her body refused to obey. It was as if she was trapped in place, her limbs frozen, her mind unable to make sense of what was happening. The figure leaned closer, its face coming into sharper focus. But it wasn't the face of Tom. It wasn't even human. It was something darker, something ancient, something twisted. And then it spoke again, its voice ringing in her ears. The figure leaned closer, its face coming into sharper focus. But it wasn't the face of Tom. It wasn't even human. It was something darker, something ancient, something twisted. And then it spoke again, its voice ringing in her ears. "You belong here now, Sarah. There's no going back." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, reverberating in the space around her, as if the very air was alive with the voice of the figure. "You belong here now, Sarah. There's no going back." Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythmic thudding of her pulse drowning out everything else. She struggled to breathe, the air feeling thick and oppressive. The figure's words were like ice water coursing through her veins, numbing her body and mind. No going back. What did that even mean? Sarah's knees trembled, the ground beneath her now feeling like quicksand. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but her body refused to obey. The darkness around her felt like it was closing in, suffocating her. The figure's cold gaze never left her, as though it was weighing her very soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had spoken, the figure moved. But it didn't move toward her. No. It stepped backward, retreating into the harsh light that continued to grow in intensity. And with each step it took, something else began to shift in the air. The emptiness that had surrounded Sarah was no longer silent. There was a distant, humming sound, like a low, ominous vibration that seemed to seep into her bones. For the briefest of moments, Sarah thought she saw movement, shapes, appearing in the distance just beyond the light. But they were fleeting, gone as quickly as they came. Her mind raced to make sense of it, but the figure in front of her was the only thing that mattered. "Don't," it whispered, its voice like a command rather than a plea. "It's too late." Too late? Too late for what? The question swirled around her mind like a whirlpool, but before she could make sense of it, the figure's form shifted again, like smoke caught in a sudden gust of wind. The light flickered, and in that instant, Sarah's body lurched forward as if yanked by an invisible force. She stumbled, barely catching herself before falling. But the light, The thing that had drawn her in was now dimming, the world around her warping, bending in strange ways she couldn't comprehend. It felt as if the entire space around her was distorting, shifting like the pages of an old book being turned too quickly. And in that disorienting moment she heard it again, the voice. But this time it wasn't from the figure. No, it was different, louder. A voice that didn't belong to anything human. Sarah. Her name whispered through the shadows, curling around her like a serpent. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The fear inside her threatened to consume her. She wasn't alone. She had never been alone. Not since the very moment she had crossed into this forsaken place. She took a deep breath, steeling herself against the rising panic. She couldn't let it overtake her. Not now. Not when she was so close. Close to what? She didn't know, but there was something inside her, a nagging, relentless force that refused to let her give in. She couldn't leave. Not yet. The darkness shifted again, and Sarah turned her gaze toward the light, desperately trying to find something, anything, that could guide her. The shadows seemed to stretch, their edges curling in on themselves, like hands reaching out from the depths. And then, in the center of the shifting darkness, a figure emerged. This time it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the shadowy form with hollow eyes. No, this figure was human, and as it took a step toward her, her heart skipped a beat. It was him. It was Tom. Sarah, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his face etched with something unreadable, an emotion she couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't relief. It was something else. Something broken. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words got caught in her throat. It was him. She had found him. But the moment she laid eyes on him, a cold dread filled her, suffocating her from within. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the surroundings, the air, the unnatural silence. It was him. Tom, where have you been? I've been looking for you. She didn't know what else to say. Her emotions were a swirl of confusion, relief, and fear. Fear that she had never truly left the terror behind, no matter how hard she had tried. But Tom didn't respond. He didn't even move. He simply stood there watching her, his face expressionless, his eyes dull and hollow. And for the first time, Sarah understood in a way that twisted her insides. Tom wasn't alive. Not in the way she had hoped. Not in the way she had wanted to believe. I couldn't save you, she whispered, her voice breaking, the weight of it crushing her chest. I couldn't save you? Tom's lips parted, and though the words that came out of his mouth weren't clear, the tone was unmistakable. You weren't supposed to, he said. His voice was not his own. It was different, darker, twisted. And with it, the reality of the situation hit Sarah like a tidal wave. No. She gasped, stumbling backward, her hands shaking. This isn't you. This can't be real. But Tom didn't move. He stayed rooted in place, his eyes following her every movement, his expression unchanged. And as she stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the truth, a dark thought crept into her mind. Tom had never been here. He had never been lost. Not in the way she thought. Not in the way she had wanted to believe. The truth was much worse. Tom was part of this place now. He had become one with the darkness. And she was being pulled into it too. Suddenly she heard the low, hollow laughter, the same laughter she had heard before. It was the figure. It was all of them. And the sound wrapped around her like a thick fog, suffocating her thoughts, drowning out all reason. You're just like me now, Sarah. Tom's voice whispered again, a cruel smile curling at the corners of his lips. You can never leave. The air around Sarah felt colder now. Not just the bite of the unseen wind that seemed to seep through her very skin, but something more profound. A deep chill that gnawed at her bones and made her feel as though she were losing herself bit by bit. She was in the same place, but everything felt different. The walls that had once been dark and empty were now alive with movement, shadows flickering at the edges of her vision. It was as though something was watching her. No, not just watching, waiting. Every step she took felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet more unstable, like she was walking on the edge of a cliff that could crumble at any moment. The laughter, Tom's twisted, unrecognizable laughter, still echoed in her ears, a constant, grating reminder of the truth she had been so desperate to deny. She was trapped. Not just here in this forsaken place, but in the horror that had overtaken her. She had no choice but to face it, to confront the things she had feared from the very beginning. Tom had been lost to this world just as she had feared. But it wasn't just him. No, it was something much worse. He had become one of them, and now, with his hollow eyes and twisted voice, he was a reminder that no one left this place unchanged. She clutched her chest, trying to steady her breath, but it came in shallow gasps, as if the very air had thickened, turned to lead in her lungs. She had to get out of here. She had to leave. But the question was, could she? The shadowy figures seemed to be closing in again, creeping along the edges of her vision. Every time she turned her head, she saw movement, something shifting just out of sight. But when she looked directly at it, the shadows vanished, leaving her in an all-too-quiet, suffocating stillness. Her fingers tightened into fists. She had to stay focused. Tom's voice, his twisted smile, still haunted her mind, but she couldn't let it control her. She wouldn't let this place claim her too. Taking a deep breath, Sarah pushed herself to keep walking, though each step felt heavier than the last. She had to find a way out. She had to find a way to undo whatever had happened to her, to him, to everyone. She didn't know how long she had been walking. Time seemed to blur in this strange, distorted place. The light had shifted again, and now, instead of dim and flickering, it was a harsh, glaring white, like an artificial sun that offered no warmth. It made everything feel sharp and unnatural. And then, just when Sarah thought she could take no more, she heard it again. A voice. Her breath caught in her throat. This voice was different, clearer. It wasn't the disembodied whispering she had heard earlier. This voice was louder and more distinct. Sarah, it called again, but this time it wasn't just her name. The voice felt familiar, as though she had heard it before, but from someone she could never place. Someone she should have known. "Sarah, look at me." The voice came from behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. No one. The room was empty. The shadows were gone, and yet the air was thick with something unspoken, something that made her skin crawl. But then the voice called out again, and it was closer. Much closer. "Sarah, I'm here." This time, the voice sounded like it was coming from the very walls themselves. She felt it reverberate inside her chest, as though the space around her was alive with it. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the very room was speaking to her, drawing her in, making her feel that strange sense of familiarity. Sarah stepped forward cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. Her pulse quickened as the voice repeated itself, each call stronger than the last. "I'm here, Sarah. Don't be afraid." The voice was almost soothing now, gentle, like the touch of a long-lost friend. Her mind screamed at her to turn and run, to escape before it was too late, but her body refused to listen. She took another step. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way. Sarah gasped as her feet slipped from under her, and she felt herself falling, plunging into the unknown. It was like falling into the darkest part of her own soul, a place where time lost its meaning and all hope seemed to vanish. But then, just as quickly as it started, she hit the ground. Her body thudded against something soft, something yielding, but it didn't hurt. She looked around, disoriented, her vision blurry. And then she saw him. Tom. His face was the same as before, but there was something different about him now. Something more real. He was standing in front of her, not lost in the shadows like before, but clearly visible, his form solid and unyielding. "Tom," she whispered, her voice shaky. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to be afraid, Sarah. This is what you wanted." "What?" Her thoughts spiraled. "What do you mean? What's happening?" His gaze softened as he knelt down in front of her, reaching out to gently take her hand. His touch was cold, but there was something strangely comforting about it. "You wanted to save me, Sarah. You wanted to rescue me from this place," he said softly. "But you're already here. You've always been here." Her heart stopped. What was he saying? How could she be here? This wasn't where she had intended to be. This place, it wasn't her home. "You belong here now too," Tom said, his voice low and dark. "Just like me. Just like them." The realization hit Sarah with the force of a freight train. She had wanted to save him, to bring him back. But now, standing here with him in this dark, twisted place, she realized the terrible truth. She wasn't here to rescue him. She was here because she had already become one of them. And there was no escape. The weight of Tom's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah's world, once a place where she believed in the possibility of escape, now felt like a trap closing in around her. The coldness of his hand on hers was no longer comforting, It was a reminder of her own fate, a fate she had desperately tried to avoid. She had come here to save him, but now it seemed she was the one who needed saving. But from what? Tom, this can't be real, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I'm not like you. I can't be like you. Tom's eyes, once filled with warmth and life, were now dull and lifeless. They stared at her, not with pity or sympathy, but with a strange understanding. It was as though he knew something she didn't, something she wasn't ready to accept. You've always been here, Sarah, he repeated, his voice low and almost sorrowful. You've been a part of this place long before you even realized it. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to process his words. Could it be true? Had she truly been part of this place all along? The very thought sent a chill down her spine. She had been looking for answers, for a way out, but what if the truth was that there was no escape? What if there was no way back to the life she once knew? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, the room around her seemed to shift. The walls, which had been so solid before, now appeared to bend and warp, their edges blurring like the ripples on the surface of water. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest as if the entire place was closing in around her, suffocating her in its grasp. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, a low rumble shaking the very foundation of this strange, twisted reality. Sarah staggered, trying to keep her balance, but the trembling grew stronger, the vibrations coursing through her body. She looked around, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was no sign of anything that could explain what was happening. Tom, she cried, her voice filled with panic. What's happening? But Tom didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto something behind her, and his expression shifted. It was subtle, but Sarah could see it, an unmistakable hint of fear. It was enough to make her turn, her heart racing as she scanned the room, searching for the source of his fear. And that's when she saw it. A shadow, a figure, moving in the distance. It was just a silhouette at first, barely more than a flicker at the edge of her vision. But then it grew clearer, its form becoming more distinct, more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its shape seemed to distort and twist with every movement it made. The figure took a step toward them, and the ground seemed to groan beneath its weight, the very air thickening with a sense of foreboding. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Whatever it wasn't human. It was something else, something far darker, far more sinister than anything she could have imagined. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and Sarah could feel the chill crawl up her spine, her skin prickling with fear. Run, Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. It's too late for me, Sarah. But it's not too late for you. Run. She didn't need to be told twice. Without thinking, Sarah spun on her heels and began to run, her feet pounding against the floor as she raced toward the distant doorway. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure seemed to draw closer, its shadow stretching across the room like a dark omen. The sound of its footsteps echoed in her ears, growing louder with each passing second. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps as panic surged through her veins. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't escape it. With one final desperate glance over her shoulder, she saw it, the thing that had been stalking her. Its face was a blur, a grotesque mask of darkness that seemed to shift and warp with every passing moment. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and the smile that twisted its lips was one of pure malice. And then, before she could react, the shadow lunged. The world around her seemed to explode in a burst of cold darkness, a force so powerful it knocked the breath from her lungs. Sarah's body slammed into the ground, her head spinning as the world tilted around her. She could feel the pressure of the figure above her, its weight crushing her as it loomed over her, its shadow swallowing everything in sight. Sarah gasped for air, her chest heaving with each desperate breath. She tried to move, to fight, but her limbs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by the very darkness that surrounded her. She could hear its voice now, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "You can't escape, Sarah," it whispered, its voice as cold as death itself. "You belong to me now." "No?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she fought against the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to consume her. "No, I'm not. I'm not like you." The figure laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in her mind. It was the last thing she heard before the darkness swallowed her whole. Sarah's body felt like it was suspended in nothingness, her senses dulled, her mind swirling in a haze. She couldn't tell if she was awake or trapped in some twisted dream. There was no light, no sound, only a deep, oppressive silence that weighed down on her like 1,000 tons. She tried to move, to break free from the suffocating void that surrounded her, but her limbs refused to obey, as if they had been chained in place. Then the silence was broken. A faint whisper, barely audible, reached her ears. It was as if the voice came from the very air itself, brushing against her skin like a cold, unseen breath. Sarah tried to focus on it, to make sense of the words, but it was impossible. The whisper seemed to shift and distort, slipping through her grasp like smoke. And then there was a flash of light. It wasn't much, just a brief, flickering glow, but it was enough to pull her out of the darkness, enough to remind her that there was still something, somewhere beyond this place. The light grew brighter, the shadows retreating in its wake, until the space around her took shape once more. She was no longer in the void. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden shift in her surroundings. She was back in the place where it all began, the house. But it was different now. The walls were cracked and decaying, the once beautiful furnishings reduced to dust and rubble. The air smelled stale, like something had died here long ago, and the floor beneath her feet was uneven, as if the house itself was slowly sinking into the earth. This wasn't the house she had remembered. Her heart raced as she stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. The faint whispers grew louder, and she realized they were coming from all around her. They weren't just voices anymore. They were shapes, shadows that clung to the walls, moving and shifting in the corners of her vision. Sarah? The voice again. This time it was clearer, stronger. It wasn't just a whisper, it was calling her name, beckoning her forward. Sarah, the voice repeated, this time more insistent, more desperate. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want to follow it. But something about the voice, the way it seemed to seep into her very soul, made her feel as though she had no choice. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command, a demand. Sarah turned, her eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the voice. The walls, once smooth and unbroken, were now warped, as if the house itself was alive, breathing, shifting around her. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved cautiously, each step taking her deeper into the heart of this twisted place. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, near the shattered remains of an old armchair, stood a figure. It was tall, draped in shadows, its form barely visible in the dim light. But as she stepped closer, she could see it more clearly, the outline of a man she recognized. Tom. But this wasn't the Tom she knew. This was something else, something darker. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. His mouth twisted into a grin, but it wasn't the smile she remembered. It was something more sinister, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sarah, he said again, his voice low and cold. You've finally come back. Her heart skipped a beat. She felt a wave of panic rise in her chest. What is this? What's happening to me? To you? Her voice cracked, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to control. You know what's happening, Tom replied, his voice distant, as if he were speaking from a place far beyond her reach. You've always known. You just didn't want to face it. Sarah shook her head, trying to push the rising dread down. No, I don't understand. I don't. You've become part of this place, Sarah, he interrupted, his grin widening. Just like me. Just like everyone else who's ever stepped foot in this house. There's no way out. Not for you. Not for me. Not for anyone. Sarah's mind raced as his words sank in. No way out. Hadn't she always known that? Hadn't she always suspected that there was something deeply wrong with this place? Something that went beyond the house itself? Something that tied her to it just as it had tied Tom? Her hands trembled as she took a step back. I won't stay here. I can't. She turned to run, but the shadows seemed to reach out for her, closing in on her with each step she took. It was as though the very walls were alive, shifting and contorting to keep her from escaping. But then a new voice, this one more familiar, cut through the tension. Sarah, it's not too late. Her heart stopped. The voice, it was her own. She looked up, eyes wide in shock. There, standing before her, was herself. But this version of Sarah was different. Older, worn, with dark circles under her eyes and a look of deep sorrow etched into her features. What are you?" Sarah whispered, fear flooding her chest. "This place. It changes you," the other Sarah said, her voice soft, almost mournful. "It makes you into something else. Something that isn't you. But you can still choose. You can still break free." Sarah stepped back, her mind spinning. The room around her seemed to distort again, the walls closing in, the air thick with an unspoken pressure. She couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. "I'm you, Sarah," the older version of herself continued. "I've been trapped here for so long and I know what it's like. But you don't have to become like me. You don't have to give in." The shadows were closing in and the ground was trembling again. The house, this cursed place, was alive with something dark and ancient. It was swallowing everything that had ever existed within its walls. "What do I do?" Sarah cried, her voice desperate. "How do I escape this? How do I break free?" The older Sarah stepped forward, her eyes full of sorrow. "You can't escape, not really. But you can make a choice. You can either give in, let the house consume you, or you can fight it, fight for the part of you that still remembers what it was like to be human." Sarah felt the pull of the darkness, the weight of the shadows pressing in on her. She could feel herself weakening, the fear and despair threatening to overtake her. But in the distance there was something else, a flicker of light. A sliver of hope, faint but undeniable. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know if it could save her. But in that moment she knew one thing for sure. She had to try. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, as the shadows around her closed in like an unrelenting storm. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The older version of herself, the one who had warned her of what was to come, stood before her, watching with a sad, knowing expression. "Fight, Sarah. You have to fight," the older Sarah urged, her voice barely a whisper over the oppressive silence. But how could she fight something that seemed so all-encompassing? How could she fight when the very walls, the very air, seemed to be conspiring against her? This wasn't just a house, it was a prison. A prison built on fear, on despair, on darkness. And no matter how much she struggled, it felt like there was no way out. The darkness around her grew thicker, suffocating her, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows stretched out like fingers, crawling up her legs, her arms, dragging her toward the ground. She felt the weight of it all, the weight of her past, her choices, her fear, bearing down on her, threatening to crush her under its oppressive force. "You can't fight it," Tom's voice echoed in the distance, distant yet somehow close, as if it were inside her own mind. "You're already part of it." "No," Sarah shouted, the word echoing in the stillness. "I'm not part of this. I'm not like you." But the shadows only tightened their grip, pulling her closer to the ground, dragging her into the darkness that had swallowed Tom and so many others before him. The older Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You can't run from it, Sarah. You can't escape it. It's a part of you now." The words stung like a slap in the face. But as the older Sarah's words sank in, something clicked inside Sarah. A flicker of realization. A small, quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered one simple truth. She had always had a choice. The darkness, the fear, the shadows, they could only control her if she let them. She had been running from this place for so long, trying to outrun the truth, trying to outrun herself. But now she understood. This place didn't hold the power over her that she had thought. It only had the power she allowed it to have. With a strength she didn't know she had, Sarah dug her feet into the ground, her body trembling, but her resolve firm. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as the shadows threatened to consume her. She wasn't going to let them win. She wasn't going to let this place take her too. "I am not you," Sarah whispered, her voice steady now, filled with defiance. "I am not part of this." The shadows recoiled as if stung, pulling back from her. She felt the weight of them lift, the pressure on her chest easing. The older Sarah's expression faltered for a moment, as if seeing something she hadn't expected. Hope, strength, a refusal to succumb to the darkness. "You still have time," the older Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper now. "But you have to act fast. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to escape." Sarah didn't wait. Without thinking, she turned toward the flickering light in the distance, the one that had been calling to her. It wasn't just a physical light. It was a beacon, a symbol of everything she had fought for, the part of herself she had almost forgotten. It was the part of her that still remembered what it meant to be free. She pushed herself forward, her legs shaky but strong. The shadows reached out to grab her, to pull her back, but she didn't stop. She ran faster, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The light grew brighter as she drew closer, the darkness around her thinning, retreating, almost as if it were afraid. When Sarah finally reached the light, she didn't hesitate. She stepped into it without looking back, without questioning it. The moment her foot crossed into the light, the world around her shattered. The darkness, the house, the fear, it all dissolved into nothingness. It was like waking from a nightmare, only this time the nightmare was gone for good. Sarah gasped, the fresh air filling her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt truly alive. The world around her was different now, clearer, brighter, as if everything had been washed clean. She was standing in a forest, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene, and most importantly, it was real. She closed her eyes, letting the calm wash over her. She was free. But the journey wasn't over. She knew that. There was still more to do, more to face. But for the first time, she felt ready. She had faced the darkness, faced the fear, and had come out stronger on the other side. As she took a deep breath and looked around, she realized that this was just the beginning. And whatever came next, she was ready for it. This concludes the story. I hope this ending feels satisfying and leaves the viewers with a sense of closure while still keeping the mystery alive. Story 3. It was a night that felt like no other. The wind howled like it was in pain, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the pavement. And in the midst of this strange, unsettling evening, a voice called out, a voice that shouldn't have been there. A voice that didn't belong. Is anyone there? James stopped dead in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat. He had been walking home from a late shift, the streets deserted and quiet, when the voice pierced the stillness. It was soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, but unmistakable. He glanced around, expecting to see someone, anyone, standing in the shadows, but the street was empty. Still, the feeling that something was wrong pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. He turned the corner, his pace quickening as he tried to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. The only sound was his own footsteps, echoing against the empty buildings. But then, it came again. Is anyone there? This time the voice was louder, closer. It sent a shiver up his spine, freezing him where he stood. He looked around frantically, his heart pounding, but there was nothing. No one. And yet the voice persisted. It was a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. James couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize what was happening. He was alone, wasn't he? He swallowed hard and began to move faster. But the moment he did, the voice followed him, growing louder, as if it were right behind him. Is anyone there? James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. It wasn't just a voice, it was a warning. Something was out there, something waiting. But what? In that moment, he wanted to turn back, to run home and lock the door, but a part of him was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The voice seemed to mock his fear, a cruel, insistent sound that wouldn't let him go. He felt like he was being watched, like every corner, every shadow held something that didn't want to be found. He dared a glance behind him. There was nothing there, no figure, no sign of life. Yet the voice kept coming, relentless, growing louder. Is anyone there? James' mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was just his exhaustion playing tricks on him. Maybe he was imagining things. But deep down he knew something was terribly wrong. He had to get out of there. He turned the corner, hoping to find some sense of security in the next block. But as he did, he froze. There, at the end of the alley, stood a figure. A figure he had never seen before. The figure was tall, its features obscured by a long, dark coat. The wind picked up, whipping the coat around like a shadow itself. James could feel his heart thudding in his chest as his mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. Then the voice came again, this time not from the shadows but from the figure itself. Is anyone there? James stumbled backward, his breath quickening, but the figure didn't move. He just stood there waiting, watching. His eyes locked onto the figure's silhouette, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Something was off. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just some passerby. This wasn't a coincidence. The figure was here for him, and it had been waiting. As the wind howled louder, he took a step back, but the figure didn't flinch. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting for James to make the next move. And then, without warning, the figure spoke again, its voice like ice scraping against his soul. "Come closer." The air was thick, suffocating, as if the world itself held its breath. James felt his legs tremble beneath him, his mind fighting to grasp hold of some semblance of reality. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, as the figure stood motionless, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. "Come closer." The words rang out, sharp and cold, like the strike of a blade against his soul. They echoed in his mind over and over, but no matter how hard he tried to shake them, they wouldn't leave. They seemed to crawl into his thoughts, settling there like a dark seed. The figure's words weren't a suggestion, they were a command. James wanted to scream, wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. His body was betraying him, refusing to move even an inch. Every instinct in him screamed to escape, but his gaze remained locked on the figure. The figure hadn't moved. It just stood there, as still as a statue, its face hidden beneath the hood of its coat. James couldn't make out any features, just a shadowy outline that seemed to absorb the faint light from the street. "Why?" The word escaped James' lips before he could stop it. His voice trembled, barely a whisper, but the figure heard it. "Why?" The figure repeated, its voice mocking, as if it knew exactly what James was feeling. "You ask why, but that's not for you to know." James swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The wind picked up again, howling through the empty streets, but it felt like it was coming from within him, from the dark corners of his mind. His pulse quickened as his mind raced. What did the figure want? Why was it following him? Was this some sick joke, or was something darker at play here? The thoughts spiraled faster and faster, but every answer seemed to lead to more questions. "Come closer," the figure repeated, its voice now quieter, almost soothing, as if it were trying to lull him into a trance. Without thinking, James took a step forward. He didn't know why, he didn't want to, yet he felt compelled to do so. It was as if some unseen force was guiding him, pushing him forward against his will. His breath caught in his throat as he moved closer, the figure's silhouette growing clearer. Each step felt like an eternity, but it felt like he couldn't stop himself. It was as if his body had a mind of its own. His eyes remained fixed on the figure, unable to look away. As he drew nearer, he could feel the temperature drop. His skin prickled with a cold that dug deep into his bones, an unnatural chill that made his teeth chatter. It was as if the very air around him had become alive, suffocating him, twisting and curling like something tangible. The figure remained silent, its face still hidden beneath the hood, but James could sense its eyes on him. Eyes that pierced through him even if he couldn't see them. "Closer," the figure whispered again, the word lingering in the air like a breath, slow and deliberate. A surge of panic hit James, and he stumbled back, breaking the invisible grip the figure had on him. His heart raced, and his mind screamed at him to run. But as he turned to flee, something froze him in place. It wasn't the figure, it was something else. A presence behind him, just beyond his reach. He turned slowly, dread seeping into his every pore, and there it was. A shape. A shadow, darker than the night itself, moving just out of his line of sight. It shifted, twisting and contorting, growing larger, more monstrous with every second. James' breath caught in his throat as he stumbled back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a man. This wasn't just some stranger in the dark. There was something else, something far worse, lurking just beyond his understanding. The shadow moved again, this time in a swift, jerking motion, like a puppet with strings pulled by unseen hands. It was closer now, closer than ever before, and James could feel its cold, suffocating presence closing in. "Help me!" James screamed, his voice raw with terror, but it was no use. No one was there. The shadow continued to close the gap, and the figure, still standing motionless, seemed to smile. A slow, twisted smile that sent a chill so deep through James' veins, it felt like his very soul was being consumed. And just when he thought he couldn't take it any longer, just when the terror reached its peak, the figure spoke again, its voice like a snake's hiss. "Not yet." The words lingered in the air, cold and chilling, like a knife digging deeper into James' already frayed nerves. "Not yet." The figure's voice had a power to it, as if it controlled not just the night, but the very essence of fear itself. James stood frozen, his breath shallow and uneven, the growing dread in his chest threatening to explode. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, elongating every second into an eternity. The air around him felt thicker now, as if something ancient and forgotten was closing in. The streetlights flickered, their weak light casting a faint glow on the figure, but it did little to illuminate the dread that loomed in the space between them. James' feet were rooted to the ground. Every instinct told him to run, to escape the grasp of whatever nightmare he had found himself in. But his legs wouldn't obey. His mind screamed at him to flee, but his body betrayed him. And then the shadow moved again. It wasn't the slow, methodical movements of a man. It was something darker, something more monstrous. The figure was no longer alone. It had companions. James could barely make out the shapes in the corner of his vision, figures that blended seamlessly with the night, like ghosts lurking just beyond the reach of light. Their forms shifted, growing and shrinking, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force, each movement a twisted mockery of human motion. James wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat, strangled by the thick air pressing down on him. He tried to look away, but his gaze was drawn back to the figure in the coat, who still stood unmoving, watching him with an intensity that seemed to burn through him. "Why are you doing this?" James forced the words out, his voice shaky, but the figure didn't respond right away. Instead, it took a small step forward, the sound of its boots scraping against the gravel of the street sending a jolt of fear through James' spine. The figure's hood shifted slightly, and for the first time, James saw its face, if it could even be called that. It was pale, almost sickly, with skin stretched tight over the bones, as though the person beneath it had been dead for years. The eyes, dark and hollow, stared back at James with an intensity that made his blood run cold. There was no warmth there, no humanity, only emptiness. "You should be afraid," the figure said, its voice now a low, hollow whisper. "You are not meant to understand. Not yet." The words echoed in James' mind, each syllable pulling him deeper into a void he could not escape. What did it mean? What was happening? None of this made sense. He had just been walking home, lost in his thoughts, when suddenly he was trapped in a nightmare. But what was the nightmare, and why was he the one caught in it? The shadow behind him seemed to grow, pressing in, the shapes becoming clearer now. James could see twisted faces, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide and filled with a terror that mirrored his own. They were all around him, encircling him, but he couldn't look away from the figure in the coat. "Do you want to know?" the figure asked, its voice curling around James' mind like a serpent. "Do you want to know why you are here?" The question was not just a question, it was an invitation. An invitation to step closer to the edge, to dive into the darkness. It was a question that James felt he could not refuse, even as every part of him screamed to run. "Yes," James whispered, his voice barely audible, but it was enough. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering James' answer. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it reached into the folds of its coat. The action seemed to drag on forever, as if the figure were pulling something from the very fabric of the night itself. Finally, it pulled out a small, blackened object, something that gleamed in the dim light of the street. James couldn't quite make out what it was, but his stomach twisted at the sight of it. The figure held the object up, and for a moment, everything stopped. The shadows froze, the wind died, and the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a voice that dripped with malice, the figure spoke again. "This is what happens when you don't listen." James' heart skipped a beat as the object in the figure's hand began to pulse with an eerie light. It was as if the very night itself was reacting to it, the darkness seeming to stretch and twist around it. James' mind raced. He needed to get out. He needed to escape. But before he could move, the figure's voice rang out again, commanding, cold and unyielding. Not yet. The world seemed to tilt. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if everything was slipping away, pulling him into a dark abyss. The shadows that had been lurking around him, those twisted figures, began to move closer, faster, their forms growing more distorted with each passing second. Their eyes gleamed, their mouths stretched wide, ready to swallow him whole. And then, suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. The fall was immediate and terrifying. James felt the world rip away beneath him, the ground vanishing in an instant. There was no time to react, no time to even scream. His body hurtled down, the air rushing past him, sharp and cold as if it carried the weight of his own panic. He reached out, instinctively grasping for anything that might slow his descent, but there was nothing. Only emptiness. He fell through the darkness, the silence consuming him. It wasn't the kind of silence one would expect in a moment of freefall, though. No, this silence was suffocating, thick and oppressive, as if the void around him had been waiting for him, waiting to swallow him whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the fall stopped. James crashed onto a hard surface, the impact jarring his bones, sending a sharp pain through his body. He lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his mind spinning. His senses were on overload, his heart racing, his chest tight, his legs aching from the shock of the fall. But as he slowly rose to his feet, a terrible realization settled over him. He was no longer on the street. The place where he had landed was dark, darker than anything he had ever known. It was a strange, cavernous space, the air thick with dust and the scent of rot. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were jagged and uneven, black stone stretching upward into the unknown. There were no lights, no windows. It was as if he had been dropped into the very belly of the earth. He stumbled to his feet, his mind still reeling. Was this real? Was this some kind of twisted dream, or had he truly fallen into something darker? But before he could take another step, he heard a sound. A low, grinding noise echoed from the depths of the space, followed by another, and then another. It was a rhythmic sound like footsteps, but not quite. The noise grew louder, the air thickening with each passing second. It was coming closer. James felt his body freeze, a wave of icy terror spreading through him. His instincts told him to run, to flee from whatever was approaching. But his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't move. The fear held him in place, like invisible chains tightening around his chest, suffocating him. The noise continued, louder now, closer still. It was almost deafening, the rhythmic grinding growing faster and faster, until it felt as though the entire cavern was shaking with it. The walls seemed to close in, the very air around him growing thicker with every second. And then, just as the sound reached its peak, the source of it stepped into view. It was a figure, but not one that James could comprehend. It was like something from his worst nightmares, something so grotesque, so alien, that his mind could barely process it. Its body was hunched, twisted in unnatural ways, the limbs elongated and clawed, dragging across the ground with an eerie, dragging motion. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of skin, but there were dark, empty sockets where eyes should be. It opened its mouth, a gaping maw, and from it came a sound, a shrill, bone-chilling wail that tore through the air, making James' stomach turn. He stepped back, stumbling over his own feet, his heart pounding so loud in his chest that it drowned out everything else. The figure's gaze, if it could even be called that, seemed to settle on him, the darkness of its face sucking him in. The air felt thick with its presence as though it were suffocating him. "Please?" James whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with the weight of his fear. "What do you want from me?" The figure did not respond. Instead, it took another step forward, its movements slow and deliberate as if it had all the time in the world. And then a voice, low and guttural, rumbled from within the depths of its chest. "You're not meant to be here." The words hit James like a physical blow. They weren't a warning. They weren't even a command. They were something worse, a simple truth, spoken with an unshakable certainty. He didn't belong here. But what was this place? Where was he? The figure moved closer still, its unnatural, elongated limbs reaching toward him with an inhuman grace. James' heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. It wasn't just walking toward him, it was hunting him. A surge of terror flooded his veins. His fight-or-flight response kicked in, but his legs still refused to cooperate. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run, no way to hide. The figure's long claws scraped against the ground as it moved closer, dragging its twisted form toward him. James took a deep breath, the air heavy in his lungs. He knew he had to do something, anything, but his body refused to listen. The creature's mouth opened wider, and for a split second, James thought he saw something moving inside. Something shifting, something alive, crawling through the darkness like a nightmare made flesh. And then, just as it reached out to him, everything went black. The darkness that swallowed James was absolute. It was as if the world itself had ceased to exist, leaving him suspended in an endless void. There was no sound, no movement, just the suffocating emptiness that clung to him like a second skin. He could feel nothing, see nothing, and for the briefest moment, he wondered if he had truly fallen into some abyss where even death could not reach him. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, the void lifted. James gasped, his lungs filling with air, the harsh reality of it burning his throat. The darkness receded, revealing a scene far more terrifying than the one he had just escaped. His surroundings were different now. He was no longer in that cavernous space. Instead, he was in a hallway. But it wasn't just any hallway. The walls were made of blackened, scorched wood, charred and splintered as if the place had been ravaged by fire. The floor beneath him creaked and groaned, each step echoing in the stillness like a death knell. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a stench that burned his nostrils and made his stomach turn. He could feel the weight of something watching him, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The hallway stretched on endlessly before him, the darkness at the end of it swallowing up the light from the flickering bulbs above him. It felt like a place that had been abandoned long ago, forgotten by time and left to rot in the shadows. James took a cautious step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He had no idea where he was, no idea how he had gotten here. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. He couldn't stand still, couldn't let the fear paralyze him like it had before. The creature, whatever it was, had been too close, too real. And now, something even worse seemed to be waiting for him in this forsaken place. As he moved deeper into the hallway, the temperature dropped. A cold that felt unnatural in a way that went beyond just a simple chill, crept into his bones. His breath fogged in front of him, hanging in the air like smoke, twisting and curling before vanishing into the blackness. The oppressive silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath him. He reached a door at the end of the hall. It was old, battered, and covered in layers of grime and dust. There was something about it, though, something that made his pulse race. Something inside him screamed to open it, even though every instinct he had told him not to. But he didn't have much of a choice. He couldn't turn back. Not after everything that had happened. James reached for the handle, the cold metal sending a jolt through his body as he turned it. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, the sound reverberating through the empty space. As it swung wide, James stepped into the room beyond, his heart pounding. It was a small, dimly lit room, sparsely furnished with nothing but a single chair in the center. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with what seemed like old, dusty books. There was no sign of life, nothing to suggest that anyone had been here for a long time. But there was something off about the room, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The air felt heavy, like it had been trapped inside this place for centuries, and James felt as though he were intruding on something ancient, something forgotten. He stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves. The books were worn, their covers cracked and yellowed with age. But as he looked closer, he saw that some of them were not books at all. They were journals. Thick, leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with faded ink and strange symbols that he couldn't quite decipher. Something about those symbols called to him, pulling him closer, urging him to pick up one of the journals. But as his fingers brushed against the cover of one, a chill ran down his spine. He pulled his hand back instinctively, as if the journal itself had burned him. And then, from the corner of the room, he heard it. A whisper. It was soft at first, just a faint murmur like the wind rustling through leaves. But then it grew louder. A voice, low and guttural, speaking words he couldn't understand. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, from a shadow so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. The voice seemed to vibrate in his chest, like it was speaking directly to his soul. James spun around, his heart racing. The room was empty. There was no one there. No one except for him. Yet the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. Help me. It wasn't just a whisper now. The voice was clear, desperate, pleading. It seemed to echo in his mind, reverberating through his thoughts like an unwelcome guest. Who are you? James croaked, his voice trembling. But the voice didn't answer. Instead, a shadow shifted in the corner and something began to move. James could barely make out the figure in the darkness, but what he saw made his blood run cold. It was a shape, a human shape, crawling toward him. Its limbs were twisted and contorted, like they didn't belong to a human body. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and its eyes were wide open, bloodshot, and filled with terror. But it wasn't the figure itself that terrified James. It was the way it moved, slowly, deliberately, as though it had all the time in the world. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it stopped. The room fell silent once more. James stood frozen, his pulse thundering in his ears. He had to leave. He couldn't stay here any longer. But as he turned to leave, he saw something else, a small detail he had missed earlier. At the far side of the room, a door stood ajar, a faint light spilling from the crack. It was different from the one he had just come through. This door, it seemed to beckon him. Without thinking, his legs moved before his mind could protest. He walked toward the door, drawn to it even as a voice inside screamed for him to stop. He reached for the handle, his fingers shaking as they brushed the cold metal. The moment James touched the handle, a jolt of electricity shot through his arm, almost as if the door had been waiting for him. He hesitated, his hands still gripping the cold metal, his mind swirling with doubt. He had no idea what was beyond it, no idea whether stepping through would lead to salvation or damnation. But some pull deep inside him, urged him forward. The voice, the one from the corner of the room, seemed to whisper again, more insistent this time, Go through. He couldn't explain why, but he turned the handle. The door creaked open and a sliver of light spilled into the dark room. It was warm light, soft and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating atmosphere he had just escaped. The very air on the other side of the door felt different, cleaner, like stepping into a new world. James stepped forward, cautiously at first, the door groaning as it swung wide. The world beyond it was a vast, empty space, illuminated by a faint, ethereal glow. The floor was smooth, polished stone, stretching out into the distance, disappearing into a horizon that he could not see. Above him, the ceiling arched high into the air, covered in strange carvings, ancient symbols etched into the stone like a map of some forgotten time. But the most unsettling part was the silence. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating silence of the hallway. No, this silence was different. It was serene, almost peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made you question if anything could ever disturb it. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he stepped further into the room. There was something ancient here, something powerful, and it made him feel small, insignificant. As he moved deeper into the room, his eyes were drawn to a figure at the far end. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a person, a woman standing motionless, her back to him. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, and her hands were clasped in front of her. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, but the fabric looked old, worn, like it had been sitting in a chest for centuries. James took another step toward her, his heart pounding. There was something about her that felt familiar, like he had seen her before, but he couldn't quite place where. Something about her presence was calming, almost hypnotic, but at the same time, there was an undercurrent of dread, a feeling that the closer he got to her, the more he would understand just how wrong everything was. Who are you?" he called out, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. She didn't move. He took another step, and then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. Her face was turned toward the floor, her expression hidden beneath the veil of her hair. For a moment he thought he saw a faint glimmer in the dim light, a sparkle like tears, but he couldn't be sure. "Are you real?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. At the sound of his voice, the woman's head slowly tilted upward, and for the first time James saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to swallow all light, sucking the warmth from the room. There was no life in them, no emotion, no expression. Just the emptiness of a soul long forgotten. But her face was beautiful, impossibly beautiful, as if carved by a sculptor who had perfected every feature. Her lips were slightly parted, and her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if she hadn't seen the sun in years. "Why are you here?" she finally spoke, her voice soft like a breeze. But there was a weight to her words, something heavy, as though they were not just meant for him, but for the entire world. James took a step back, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. I don't know. I was just... "You should not have come," she interrupted, her voice suddenly cold. "None of you should have come." The air around him seemed to grow colder, the room's serene silence shattered by the sharpness of her tone. A chill ran through James' spine, his pulse quickening. He could feel the temperature drop, the warmth that had filled the room now replaced by an unbearable cold. The shadows around them deepened, as though something were closing in on him, pressing in from all sides. "Why?" James asked, his voice barely audible. "What is this place?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements graceful but unnervingly slow. Her feet did not touch the ground. Her gown seemed to float just above it, as if she were hovering inches above the floor. "You must leave," she said again, her voice now tinged with something darker, something almost threatening. "You must turn back before it's too late." James' mind raced. Was this woman trying to warn him? Or was she leading him into something far worse? His body screamed at him to turn around, to leave this place and never look back. But his feet were rooted to the ground, as though some invisible force held him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from her. I can't leave," James whispered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I need to know what's going on. I need to know how to get out of here." Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was something far more sinister, like she knew a secret that he didn't, and that secret was one he didn't want to hear. "You're already too late," she said softly. "It's already begun." Before James could respond, a loud, ear-splitting crash echoed through the room, sending him stumbling back in shock. The ground beneath him trembled, as if the very foundation of the place was shaking. The woman's face remained unchanged, but her eyes narrowed as she turned toward the source of the noise. "Get out," she hissed, her voice now full of urgency. "Now, before it finds you." James didn't need to be told twice. Panic surged through him as he turned and ran, not daring to look back. The room seemed to stretch and twist as he ran, the walls closing in on him, the darkness thickening. He could feel the floor beneath him shifting, as though it was no longer solid, but alive. Something was following him, something that had been awakened. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape before whatever it was caught him. James ran through the twisting corridors, his footsteps echoing loudly in the otherwise silent space. The walls seemed to pulse with each step, as though they were alive and watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. His breath came in ragged gasps, his chest burning as he sprinted blindly down the hallway. The door he had just come through, the one that had seemed like a path to something better, was now out of sight, swallowed up by the ever-changing maze of rooms and corridors. He couldn't remember how long he had been running, or how many doors he had passed. The place felt endless. There was no clear path, no sense of direction. It was as though the building itself had shifted, reconfigured itself to keep him trapped. The air had turned cold again, far colder than it had been in the room with the woman. It chilled him to the bone, a biting cold that seemed to cut through his clothes and freeze his very soul. Every now and then he heard it, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low growl, soft but unmistakable, like the sound of something hunting him, something that was getting closer. He tried to shake the feeling, to dismiss it as just his imagination playing tricks on him, but deep down he knew. He knew it was real. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. James' heart pounded in his chest as he broke into another sprint, his legs aching, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let whatever was following him catch him. He had to get out, he had to find a way out of this nightmare. And then he saw it. At the far end of the corridor, a door. It was different from the others. There was something about it, something that called to him. The door was made of dark wood, intricately carved with strange symbols and patterns that seemed to move in the low light. The air around it seemed to shimmer, a faint golden glow surrounding the edges, as if it were the only thing in this place that still held any life. Without thinking, James rushed toward it, throwing open the door with a desperate force. He didn't care what was on the other side. He just had to get away from whatever was hunting him. As he stepped through the door, the air changed again. It was warmer this time, like stepping into a place that had not been touched by the cold of the endless corridors. The room beyond was vast, an enormous circular chamber with high ceilings and walls lined with shelves that stretched up toward the darkness above. The floor was polished stone, worn smooth by centuries of use. In the center of the room stood a single pedestal, upon which sat an object covered by a dark cloth. But it wasn't the pedestal that caught his attention. It was the figure standing next to it, a tall man, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. He was motionless, his hands clasped in front of him as though he had been waiting for James. James froze in the doorway, his body tense. This man, this figure, seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain. There was a sense of recognition, a strange pull that drew him toward him. But there was something off about him, something wrong. The air around him was thick, oppressive, as though the very presence of the figure was bending reality itself. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and defiance. What is this place? What's happening? The figure didn't respond immediately. He stood there in silence, unmoving, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. It was as if he was weighing James, studying him. And then, at last, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and rich like velvet, yet carrying an undeniable sense of finality. "This place is not for the living. It never was." James took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean? I don't know how I got here. You were chosen," the figure interrupted, his voice growing colder, darker. "This place has a way of drawing people in. And once you're here, there's no way out. Not for you, not for anyone." The words hit James like a physical blow, his chest tightening with panic. "What do you mean I was chosen? Chosen for what?" The figure finally stepped forward, his cloak swishing around his feet. There was something haunting about the way he moved, too smooth, too deliberate. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and pale, and touched the edge of the cloth that covered the pedestal. "It is not the first time someone has come here," the figure said, his voice growing even more ominous. "Nor will it be the last. This place, this curse, it's been passed down for generations. And now you're part of it." James stepped backward, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. What curse? What was this man talking about? "The others who came before you," the figure continued, his voice softening, "they never left. They were consumed like the ones who came before them. There's no escape, James. You're already too far in. The moment you crossed the threshold, you became part of the history of this place." "No," James whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't be." But the figure didn't let him finish. With a swift motion, he lifted the cloth from the pedestal, revealing what lay beneath it. James' stomach turned. It was a book, an ancient tome, its cover cracked and worn, its edges ragged as though it had been torn from the hands of countless souls. It was bound in leather, its pages yellowed with age. And on the cover, etched in deep, dark letters, was a name. His name. James' breath hitched in his throat, his eyes fixed on the book in front of him. His name. How could it be? It was impossible. His name shouldn't be on anything in this place, let alone a book that looked as ancient as this one. His mind reeled, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. There had to be some mistake. There had to be another explanation. What is this?" James stammered, his voice shaky as his gaze shifted from the book back to the cloaked figure. "Why is my name on it?" The figure didn't immediately respond. He simply stood there, still and silent, watching James with those hidden eyes. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, thick with the weight of something ancient, something dark. It pressed down on James as though the room itself was alive and was suffocating him with its presence. The figure finally moved, his hand slowly reaching out to touch the edge of the book. "It's your story," he said quietly. "Your past, your future. It's all written here in the pages." James' heart pounded in his chest. He stepped back instinctively, a cold sweat breaking out along his neck. "No," he breathed, shaking his head. "No, it can't be." The figure ignored his protest, lifting the book with an unnatural ease. He opened it, the pages creaking with age as they fluttered, revealing rows and rows of text, small, cramped handwriting, written in ink that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural light. James couldn't understand it. It looked like a language he had never seen before, but the symbols on the pages felt familiar. They felt like they belonged to him, like they were somehow tied to his very existence. "This is how it works," the figure said, his voice low and calm, like he was explaining something simple, something inevitable. "This place chooses its victims, pulls them in. And once you're here, you become part of the story. A story that has no end." James' pulse quickened as he backed up further, his eyes flicking from the book to the figure. "What do you mean, part of the story?" he demanded. "How do I get out? I don't belong here." The figure's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile without warmth, cold, distant, like a predator's grin. "You don't get out," he said softly, almost with pity. "No one does. Not once your name is in the book." James' mind raced, desperately searching for a way to break free from this. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground as if some invisible force had a hold of him. He couldn't move, couldn't escape. The weight of the room pressed down on him, as though it was conspiring to keep him trapped, to trap his soul in this never-ending nightmare. "Please," James whispered, his voice breaking, "please tell me there's a way out." Tell me this isn't real. The figure's smile faded, replaced by a look of something darker, something far more unsettling. You're already here, James, he said, his tone shifting to something that sent a chill through James' bones. And now you're part of the story that never ends, the one that keeps drawing more and more in over and over again. James' heart pounded harder in his chest. His mind screamed for him to wake up, to tear himself from this nightmare and go back to a world where he wasn't being hunted, where he wasn't trapped in a story that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was no waking up. Look at the pages, the figure said, his voice suddenly sharp, demanding. Look at what's written about you. Reluctantly, James stepped forward, his legs trembling beneath him as he approached the pedestal. His eyes flicked down to the open pages of the book, and as he read the first few lines, his stomach dropped. It was his life. His entire life was written there, everything he had ever done, everything he had ever felt. From the moment he was born, to the time he learned to walk, to his first day at school, all the way up to that moment in the room, standing before the figure. Every detail, every memory was recorded, right down to the smallest moments. But there was more. At the end of the page there was something different, something that shouldn't be there. The words began to twist and warp as they moved down the page, the ink shifting and changing, forming new sentences, new events, future events. The final words on the page were chilling. He will never escape. He will become part of the place, just as the others have. James' blood ran cold as he read the words. It was a prophecy, a cursed future. He wasn't just trapped here, he was destined to be part of the place, to become like the others who had come before him. He would fade away into the story, never to return, never to be free. No, James gasped, stepping back from the book, his mind reeling. This can't be happening. I won't let this happen. The figure's expression remained unchanged, his eyes still hidden in the shadows of his hood. He didn't need to speak again. His presence, his words, had already sealed James' fate. The book was more than just a record of his life. It was his future, written in stone, unchangeable. And now there was no way out. Suddenly, the room around them seemed to shift, the walls closing in, the air growing thick and heavy. The figure stepped back, his hands moving to close the book, and as he did, the light in the room flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls. James turned to run, but his legs were like lead. He couldn't move. His body refused to obey him. The room was closing in around him, the book's ominous words echoing in his mind. You're already part of the story, the figure whispered, his voice drifting through the suffocating air. And there's nothing you can do to change that. James' body froze, the air thick around him, pressing against him like a heavy weight. His legs felt as though they were anchored to the stone floor, unyielding and immovable. The room had changed, or perhaps it was him that had changed. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the space around him until it felt like the very walls themselves were suffocating him. The shadows stretched out like fingers, clawing at his mind, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The figure moved, gliding across the room with a disturbing grace, his footsteps barely making a sound on the stone floor. James tried to turn, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. It was as though something was holding him back, chaining him in place. The figure stood before him, close enough now that James could feel the chill emanating from his hooded form. He was not human. He could feel it deep in his bones. There was something otherworldly about him, something ancient and beyond comprehension. The man, if that's what he was, stared at James with eyes that remained hidden beneath the folds of his cloak, but James could feel their gaze, penetrating and knowing, like the weight of 1,000 years pressing down on him. You still don't understand, do you? The figure's voice was like a whisper, low and menacing, yet carrying a strange weight. You're already part of the story. You've always been part of it. James opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His mind was in a haze, swirling with confusion and disbelief. He had never believed in the supernatural, in ghosts or curses. But this place was something beyond his understanding. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been twisted, bent to the will of some malevolent force. Why me? James managed to croak, his voice hoarse, his throat dry with fear. Why am I here? What do you want from me? The figure's lips curved into a thin, mocking smile. It's not about what I want, he replied. It's about what this place wants. This place, this thing. It doesn't care about you, James. It doesn't care about anyone. It only cares about feeding, about taking. And you were chosen. James' stomach churned as the figure's words sank in. Chosen. It was all coming together now. The endless corridors, the shifting rooms, the book with his name on it. This was no accident. He wasn't here because of some strange twist of fate. He had been brought here, pulled into this place for a reason. But the reason didn't make sense. It couldn't. No, James whispered, shaking his head, disbelief flooding his senses. I don't accept that. I can't be part of this. I won't let this place take me. The figure's eyes narrowed, and the air in the room grew even colder. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to stretch further, seeping into the corners of the room, wrapping themselves around James like invisible hands. You have no choice, the figure said, his voice now carrying an almost cruel certainty. Once you step through that door, once you cross the threshold, you belong to it. And there is no leaving. There's only the story. The words felt like a curse, seeping into James' mind, making everything around him seem even darker, more oppressive. His vision blurred as a wave of dizziness washed over him. He could feel the weight of the book in his mind, the endless pages filled with his life, with everything he had ever done, everything he had ever known. But it wasn't just his life. It was the future too. The words from the book echoed in his mind, repeating over and over again. Asterisk, he will never escape. He will become part of the place, just as the others have. Asterisk. James stumbled back, his breath ragged. I won't. But his words caught in his throat. The shadows were closing in, the walls pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the darkness surrounding him, the cold reaching into his very soul, pulling at him, tugging at him. It wasn't just the figure. It wasn't just the place. It was everything. It was the story. The curse. His body trembled with fear, but there was no escape. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. The weight of the curse had already taken root, wrapping itself around his heart, around his mind. There was no way out, no way to break free. The figure stepped closer, and as he did, the shadows seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, swirling around him like a storm. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, of something old and forgotten, something that had been buried for centuries and was now being unearthed. You see, the figure said, his voice soft, almost compassionate now, this place is not just a prison. It's a place of rebirth. A place where stories are born and where they never end. Once you become part of it, you will live on forever. You will be part of the tale, the never-ending cycle. James' heart raced, his mind screaming for him to do something, anything to break free. But the more he fought against the pull of the place, the stronger it became. He could feel the story wrapping around him, pulling him deeper, dragging him into its depths. It was as if the story had already been written, and there was no way to change it, no way to break free. Please, James begged, his voice raw with desperation. I don't want to be part of this. I don't want to be trapped here. The figure's smile deepened, his voice turning darker. You don't have a choice. You never did. And with those final words, the shadows seemed to rise up, swallowing him whole. James' vision was a blur of darkness as the shadows swallowed him whole. For a moment there was nothing, no sound, no light, no sense of time. Just an endless void that stretched on, as if he had been consumed by the very darkness that had haunted this place. His body felt weightless, floating in the emptiness, and for a brief second he wondered if he had died. Was this what death felt like? A quiet, endless abyss where nothing mattered? But then, slowly, a faint light flickered in the distance. It was weak, barely noticeable, but it beckoned to him like a distant star in a vast, empty sky. Desperation clawed at him, and James reached for it, pushing through the oppressive void that surrounded him. The light grew stronger with each movement, a flickering flame in the distance. He didn't know how, but his legs were moving now. His body was responding, his feet pushing against an unseen surface. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to reach the light, to escape whatever this place had become. And then, with a rush, the darkness faded, and James stumbled forward into the light. It wasn't the outside world. No, this was another room, larger, darker, and yet somehow more familiar. The light that had drawn him in now seemed to hover just out of reach, casting strange, unnatural shadows on the walls. The air was cold, but not as oppressive as before. It was as if he had been placed somewhere else, somewhere that had a connection to this cursed place but was slightly different. His eyes adjusted to the dim light as he looked around. The room was empty, save for the walls that seemed to shift, like the corridors he had wandered through earlier. The floor beneath him was cracked, as though it had once been smooth but was now worn and broken. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that made no sense to him, yet seemed so familiar. They whispered in the back of his mind, pulling at something deep within him, but James couldn't understand them. It was as though they were written in a language that only this place understood. And then, from the corner of the room, a voice spoke. "You're here," it said, soft but clear, like a whisper that cut through the silence. James spun around, his heart racing as he tried to locate the source of the voice. But the room was empty. There was no one else here. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling with fear. "Show yourself." The voice laughed, a low, eerie sound that echoed off the walls. It was not the figure from before. This was something else, something more insidious. James' pulse quickened, his body frozen in place as the voice continued. "You're asking the wrong question, James," it said, the tone dark and amused. "You should be asking why you're here." James swallowed, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room was empty, yet he felt the presence of something all around him, something watching, waiting. The air felt thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. "I don't understand," James whispered, his voice barely audible. "What do you want from me? What am I supposed to do?" The voice chuckled again, but this time it was louder, more sinister. "You think you have a choice? You think you have control? No one ever has control in this place. Not you. Not anyone." The shadows in the room seemed to shift at the voice's command, elongating and twisting like living things. They stretched out across the floor and walls, creeping towards James, surrounding him. His heart thudded loudly in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps as panic surged within him. "You are part of the story now," the voice continued, its tone growing more intense, more demanding. "And there's no escaping it. You were chosen for a reason. And that reason isn't one you'll be able to change." James felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. The voice was right. He had no control. He had been brought here, pulled into this nightmare, and now there was no way out. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "Why me? Why am I the one who has to suffer this?" The voice didn't respond immediately. Instead, there was a long pause, an eerie silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. James' heart raced as the air around him seemed to grow colder still. And then, finally, the voice spoke again, its tone now dark and almost sympathetic. "You're here because you were always meant to be," it said, as though it was explaining something simple. "This place needs you, and you need it. You're part of something much bigger than yourself, James. This is where your story ends, and where it begins." James' head spun with confusion, his thoughts a chaotic mess. How could this be happening? He was just an ordinary person. He didn't deserve this. He didn't want to be part of some endless, never-ending story. "Please," he gasped, his voice hoarse, pleading. I can't be part of this." The voice ignored his pleas, its tone turning colder, more mocking. "There is no escaping. There never was." The room began to close in again. The walls, the shadows, everything seemed to move toward him, suffocating him. His chest tightened, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't breathe. It felt like the room was collapsing around him and he was being crushed under its weight. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure stopped. The room was still again. James, gasping for air, opened his eyes and looked around. The shadows had retreated, the voice had fallen silent. But something had changed. Something was different. He wasn't alone anymore. The walls were no longer just walls, they were faces. Faces of people, people who had once been like him, people who had come here before him and had been consumed by the place. They were all staring at him, their eyes hollow, their expressions vacant. They were trapped, just like him. James staggered backward, his heart racing as the realization hit him with full force. He wasn't alone. He was never alone here. There were others trapped in the story with him, lost to the endless cycle of the place. And they were waiting for him to join them. James' legs gave out and he fell to the floor, his body shaking uncontrollably. The darkness was closing in again. It was only a matter of time before he, too, would become a part of the never-ending story. James couldn't breathe. His chest tightened and his heart thundered in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. He wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the suffocating grip of the shadows that seemed to be closing in around him. But no matter how hard he tried to move, his body wouldn't respond. It felt as though something was holding him down, weighing him to the floor. He glanced up at the faces on the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on him. The faces weren't just expressions. They were distorted, twisted in unnatural ways, like the people they had once been had been stretched and pulled into grotesque shapes. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their faces frozen in eternal agony. It was like they were warning him, telling him of the fate that awaited anyone who stepped too far into this cursed place. He wanted to look away, to close his eyes, but he couldn't. Their eyes followed him, their gazes burrowing into his soul, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. Every inch of the room felt alive with their presence, like they were watching, waiting, and somehow feeding off his fear. A sharp, cold wind blew through the room, and the shadows shifted once again. They weren't just on the walls anymore. They were moving, crawling along the floor, slithering towards him like sentient creatures. James could feel them brushing against his skin, cold and damp, like icy fingers reaching for him. His mind raced. There had to be a way out of here. There had to be something he could do. But the room offered no escape. The faces on the walls seemed to leer at him, mocking his attempts to resist. They had all been through this. They were all part of it now. And soon so would he. But then, amidst the crushing despair, something changed. A noise. A distant, soft sound that broke through the stillness of the room. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A whisper. At first, James couldn't make out the words. They were too soft, too faint, like a secret too old to remember. But then, as if the sound was pulling him in, he leaned closer, straining to hear. "Not all stories end the same," the whisper said. The voice was low, distorted, and yet familiar. James' blood ran cold as he realized that the voice wasn't coming from the walls or the shadows. It was coming from inside his own head. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "No, this isn't happening." He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, trying to ignore the cold that seeped into his bones. But the whisper came again, louder this time, insistent. "Not all stories end the same, but they all start the same." The words twisted in his mind, pulling him deeper into a spiral of fear and confusion. What did it mean? What did the voice want from him? James' mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos around him. What was happening? Why was he hearing this voice? And why couldn't he escape? The darkness around him seemed to be thickening again, pressing in closer, suffocating him. But before he could give in to the overwhelming fear, a flash of light pierced through the shadows. It wasn't much, just a small, flickering flame in the distance, but it was enough. A way out. James forced himself to stand, his legs shaky and weak beneath him. The weight of the place, the oppressive darkness, had drained him of everything, but the flickering light was a lifeline. He didn't know where it led, but he knew that if he stayed here in this room with the faces and the whispers, he wouldn't make it out alive. He began to move, slowly at first, his feet heavy as they dragged across the cracked floor. The light seemed to grow further away with every step, the shadows reaching out to pull him back. "Not all stories end the same," the voice whispered again, louder now, echoing in his ears, pushing against his sanity. "But you can change it, if you act quickly." He didn't understand. What was he supposed to do? How was he supposed to change the story? He could barely think straight, his mind was a blur of fear and confusion. But the voice, whoever or whatever it was, had a point. He had to act. He had no choice. With a burst of adrenaline, James broke into a run, his heart pounding in his chest. The light in the distance grew brighter, urging him forward. The shadows seemed to chase him, crawling over the floor, trying to swallow him whole, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Every step felt like it was dragging him deeper into something unknown. The air around him grew colder, the whispers louder, but he ignored it all. All that mattered now was the light, the hope that maybe, just maybe, it could lead him to freedom. He reached out, stretching his hand toward the light, his fingers brushing against something warm, something solid. It was like a door or a threshold. He didn't know what it was, but it felt real. He could feel its presence, solid and undeniable. James didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, everything changed. The room behind him disappeared, the oppressive darkness vanishing like smoke in the wind. For a moment, everything was still, silent. But then the silence was broken. The voice, the whisper, it was back. And this time it wasn't alone. "Welcome," it said. Welcome to your new story. James' heart froze as he turned to look at what he had just stepped into. The room was different. It wasn't the same as before. This place was colder, more barren. There were no faces on the walls, no twisting shadows, but something was off. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural presence. And standing in the middle of the room was a figure. Tall, dark, watching him with those same hidden eyes. And then it spoke. Did you really think you could escape? The figure stood there, unmoving, its presence so powerful that it felt like the air itself had thickened around James. He could feel its gaze even though he couldn't see its eyes. The darkness around it seemed to press in tighter, as if the very space he was in was being consumed by the figure's weight. The room, once empty and cold, now felt alive with its energy, like the walls themselves were closing in. James' heart raced, his breath coming in short gasps as he backed away, trying to put distance between himself and the figure. But no matter how far he moved, it never seemed to get any further away. It was as though the room was shifting around him, trapping him in place. Who are you? James managed to choke out, his voice barely a whisper, but the words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with the weight of his fear. The figure didn't respond at first. It just stood there, watching him with an almost mocking stillness. James' hands trembled at his sides, his body refusing to obey him. He wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The walls, the floor, everything around him felt like it was closing in, tightening like a noose. The figure finally spoke, its voice a low, almost inaudible hum, vibrating in the very air around James. You've been running for so long, James. But there's no escaping. You can't outrun what you are. James swallowed hard, trying to process the words, but they made no sense. He was just an ordinary person. He had never done anything to deserve this, to deserve being trapped in this nightmare. What do you mean? He asked, his voice rising in desperation. What am I? The figure's presence seemed to grow stronger, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the room. You were chosen, it said, its voice growing more distinct. You were always meant to be here. Just like the others. Just like all of them. The words hit James like a physical blow. Chosen? Others? What was this thing talking about? His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the cryptic message, but every thought seemed to lead him in a circle, trapped in a web of confusion. I don't understand, James whispered, his voice shaking. Why me? Why am I here? I don't belong here. I don't belong in this nightmare. The figure moved then, slowly, deliberately, its shadow creeping toward him like a living thing. Every step it took sent a wave of icy dread through James' body, the cold seeping into his bones, numbing him from the inside out. You belong here because you have always been a part of this place, the figure said, its voice growing colder with each word. You are no different than the rest. You were just waiting to be awakened. James felt a chill wash over him. Awakened? He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like something inside him had shifted, like the figure had spoken a truth he wasn't ready to hear. He wasn't just a victim of this place. He was a part of it. The figure stepped closer, and James could feel the air growing colder, the shadows pressing in tighter around him. The voice whispered again, the words sending shivers down his spine. You thought you could escape, but there's no escape from what you are. James' mind screamed at him to run, to fight, but his body was paralyzed, caught in the grip of the figure's presence. He could feel his heart pounding, each beat a reminder that he was still alive, still fighting, but for what? What was he fighting for? The figure's voice lowered to a deadly whisper. There's no escape. You will join the others. You will become one of them. James' thoughts raced, his mind trying to grasp at anything that could make sense of this nightmare. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't become like those faces on the walls, those hollow, lifeless people who had once been just like him. I won't let you, James said, his voice hoarse, his body trembling with the effort of forcing the words out. I won't be like them. The figure's presence seemed to grow colder, darker, as if it was feeding off his fear. A low chuckle escaped from its unseen lips, a sound that reverberated through the room, sending a chill down James' spine. You don't have a choice, James, the figure said, its voice dripping with venom. This is your fate. This is the story you're a part of now. There's no running, no hiding. You can't escape your destiny. James clenched his fists, trying to summon whatever strength he had left. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and accept it. There had to be a way out. Suddenly, a strange sensation washed over him. It was like a tug, a pull from deep within. It was subtle at first, but then it grew stronger, like something inside him was awakening. Something he had never known existed. It wasn't a physical sensation, but something deeper, something primal. The figure's eyes, though hidden, seemed to lock onto him, sensing the shift in his energy. It took a step back, its shadow flickering as if it had momentarily lost its grip on the room. "Do you feel it?" the figure whispered, a mix of curiosity and warning in its voice. "You can't fight it, James. It's already inside you." James' pulse quickened as he struggled to understand what was happening. He could feel it now, the power, the force that seemed to be pulling him in. He wasn't sure if it was his will to survive, or if it was something darker, something tied to this place. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this thing control him. He wasn't going to be swallowed by the darkness. With every ounce of strength, he pushed back, forcing himself to stand tall, facing the figure with a defiance he didn't know he had. "I'm not like them," James said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "I'm not going to be part of this story. You can't make me." The figure's laugh echoed through the room, louder this time, mocking. "You think you have a choice? You think you can change the ending?" James gritted his teeth, feeling the strange power inside him surge. The figure was wrong. He could change the ending. He wasn't just a pawn in this story. He had to be more than that. "You're wrong," James whispered, more to himself than to the figure. "I am more than this." And as the words left his lips, something changed. The room seemed to tremble, the air crackling with an energy James didn't fully understand. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he had to use it. Whatever power had awakened inside him, he had to fight with it. The figure's expression, though still hidden, seemed to falter, its confidence cracking. It took a step back, a low hiss escaping from its unseen mouth. "Impossible," it whispered, as if it couldn't comprehend what was happening. "You can't, no one has ever." But before it could finish its sentence, the room exploded with a blinding light, and James felt himself being pulled toward it. James felt the pull of the light, the raw force drawing him in with an intensity he couldn't fight. His heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What had he just awakened inside himself? And where was the figure now? Was it finally defeated? As the blinding light engulfed him, everything went silent. The shadows, the figure, the room, it all vanished, replaced by a vast emptiness. There was no sense of time, no sense of place. It was like he was floating in nothingness, suspended between worlds, unsure if he was alive or dead. And then he heard it. A whisper, so faint it was barely audible but unmistakable. It was the figure's voice. "You think you won?" the voice hissed like a snake slithering through the silence. "But this is not the end. You cannot escape what you are. This place will always find you." James wanted to scream, to fight, but he was frozen, his mind racing with thoughts of what this could mean. The voice was right in a way. No matter what had happened, no matter what he had done to fight back, this place, the darkness, the entity that had haunted him, would always be there. It had always been inside him. He had been chosen for this fate from the very beginning. But James refused to give in. He took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength he had left. He had already faced the darkness, had already stared it in the face and fought back. He wouldn't let it claim him now. He wouldn't let it win. The light around him began to pulse, its energy rising and falling like the beat of a heart. It was alive, in a way, and he could feel it connecting to something deep within him. It was the same power he had felt before, the force that had surged inside him when the figure had tried to claim him. This time he didn't hesitate. With a fierce determination, James reached out, embracing the light, pulling it into himself. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew he couldn't stop now. The figure's words didn't matter. The darkness didn't matter. All that mattered was his will to survive, his refusal to be a part of this twisted fate. As the light consumed him, he felt himself being pulled forward, torn from the emptiness and thrust back into reality. The world around him began to take shape again, dark, cold, and familiar, but different somehow. He was back in the house, back in the place where it had all started. But this time it was different. The oppressive weight of the darkness was gone. The walls no longer seemed to close in on him. The shadows no longer reached out with hungry hands. It was as if the very air had cleared, the oppressive weight of the figure's presence lifted. James stood there, breathing heavily, his body trembling with the aftereffects of the battle he had just fought. But he was free. He had broken the cycle. He had escaped the darkness. And in that moment he realized the truth. The figure, the house, the darkness, it had all been a reflection of his own fears, his own doubts. It had always been inside him, waiting for him to confront it. And now that he had faced it head on, it had no power over him anymore. He had broken the chains. As he stood there, alone in the empty house, James couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace wash over him. He had survived. He had won. The nightmare was over. For now.